Professor, IGIDR and visiting fellow CDS will present the paper, How to Reverse India's Industrial Decline, Need for Reconfiguring the Policies. Professor Pulak Mishra, Department of Economics and Social Sciences, Head, Rakhi Center of Excellence for the Science of Happiness, IIT Kharagpur would be the discussant. After that, Professor Keshav Das, Dean, School of Economics and Commerce, Kalinga Institute of Industrial Technology, Bhubaneswar, Editor-in-Chief of the Odisha Economic Journal, will present the paper, MSMEs in India, a Policy Critique. Dr. K. Chandrasekhar, Assistant Professor of CDS, will be the discussant of the session. Welcome all. Let's start.
So just close this. Good morning to all. How 2 days have passed, we didn't realize actually. I didn't realize the third day of the seminar. So it's really wonderful the way it's proceeding. Yesterday we did 2-3 sessions on agriculture and rural economy. Today it is trade, industrialization and growth. Now, part of his, Dr. Raj's work on this was a little recent, but one particular paper was pretty old, that is in the 55-56 on small scale industries, which we now call micro and small industries, micro and small enterprise. But let me start with his very well-known papers in this area. One was this alternate growth patterns for his work on the growth models. That was which culminated in the famous Raj Sen model in 1961. And it was of course an inward looking model, but very realistically, because he was very well aware of the foreign exchange constraint of primary producing countries at that time, and India was one. And where do we get the imports from when our exports are so low? So Raj Sen model was actually also like the Feldman-Mahalanobis model, 4-sector model, but Raj had, they had disaggregated the investment sector a little more, because they had an investment sector for consumer good production and investment sector for raw materials, and they had an intermediate sector. So I thought the whole thing was, though taking off from Mahalanobis Feldman, it was much more realistic a model of economic growth and made us aware of the sort of constraints we have. And in a way also being skeptical about the underlying Lewisian, this whole issue of flow of unlimited supplies of labor from the rural areas to the urban areas. I mean, that was very clear to Raj that would never happen, because social organization of production is so different in developing countries and in certain regions. They will probably never be able to spare those workers. And what happens to wage rates in such a situation? And what happens to them when they go to the urban areas and get employment in very capital intensive? Do they get employment in the type of capital industries capital intensive industries we are thinking of? So these are very realistic things that he had in mind, and the paper was made. But unfortunately, this paper didn't get much attention. I think it was swamped by the Feldman-Mahalanobis model's very appealing approach to rapid industrialization and the commanding heights of the public sector. So this didn't get much attention. But there were later attempts by, in I think early 80s, somebody called Cooper, and they tried to extend this to other developing economies, being a much more realistic. So this was one of his major works on the models of growth. The second very interesting paper, which was the growth, growth and stagnation in industries, in the Indian industrial development. Because what all he had predicted was actually turning out to be true. There was a growing foreign exchange crisis, there was food deficit, there was inflation, there was unemployment. So all this was happening, and the fourth plan, of course, had really got mixed up, had got entangled in a huge problem because of the foreign exchange crisis and the food crisis. And this paper, he discussed the industrial stagnation from the mid-60s onwards. And that, of course, as we know, stirred up a huge debate on industrial stagnation in India, we know that. And interestingly, Raj himself went back to this paper in the early 80s and said that it's probably not a secular decline, because the 70s, the late 70s and early 80s just do show a small increase in GDP growth rates, not so much in the manufacturing sector growth rates. But anyway, other works had shown that even after 80s there is a secular decline in industrial stagnation, and I think that becomes a very important question now for one of the speakers on how do we reverse this industrial decline. The third and the most interesting thing for me was the small scale industries that he talked about. I think you must have come across it in 1955, 56, because when I was doing my thesis on rural industrialization, I had a chance to look at that whole debate. There was a whole debate on small scale sector and technological change. That was the context. Because consumer goods were supposed to be met by the large, small and village industries. And the question was, would they be able to deliver the consumption goods in the quantities required because of the nature of their production systems? So should we not introduce technology into these industries? There the debate was on the choice of techniques and the scale of the sector, and Raj was very clear, and this is what really impressed me. You know, Raj is thinking about the workers and the people at the bottom. When he talked about industrial change, very good, there should be technological change, he didn't deny that fact. But the point is, you have to also look at what happens to the total output, the volume of output, but you also have to keep in mind the rate of growth of output. Because there are certain leakages which take place when the surplus is generated. And those leakages can bring down the rate of growth of output. And what are those leakages? One of them is subsistence for those workers who are displaced from industries undergoing technical change. I was very impressed with this. And I thought whenever he talked about manufacturing or technical change, he always looked at what was the impact on the workers, and that's what we have to keep in mind. So quickly, I don't want to take more time, but my three questions emerging from my reading of Raj's, one is, how do we envisage now the shape of or the process of industrial growth? How do we reverse it? This is the question you were asking. So that, what is the state of unutilized capacity? I forgot to mention that in that paper on growth and stagnation, he said there were two disturbing features of the Indian planned development. One was huge amounts of unutilized capacity in the manufacturing sector. The second, of course, was the fact of the stagnation in output. And one of the major things for that he said was because of the crisis in the agricultural sector. The demand largely will come from there, but the demand is not coming from there because the crisis in the agricultural sector, which according to Lewis was supposed to adjust to the requirements of the rapid industrialization process, but it didn't. There are certain changes which have to be made consciously, and interventions have to be made consciously in the agricultural sector, and therefore the demand was not growing in the way demand should be growing. So this is the second thing I would like to as a question is technology generation, especially generation 4 technologies now, generation 4 technologies now. In such a situation, what happens to the small scale sector and what happens to employment is another very interesting question that we have to ask. And the third, of course, is what is happening to underutilized? Do we have a lot of underutilized capacity in the manufacturing sector? Now is another question which comes to my mind, but you can speak on whatever you want to speak. But these are some of the questions which came from Raj's writings and which have a lot of relevance now. So thank you so much. I'll ask now Nagaraj. I'll ask Professor Nagaraj to speak on, am I supposed to give an introduction of you? Has something been said about you? Because I don't have anything to say. I mean, I don't have it written down here. Okay. So, okay, Nagaraj is an alumni. How to reverse India's industrial decline, need for reconfiguring the policies.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Understanding industrialization has been one of my learnings from Professor Raj's many writings. This is my current concern, what's happened during the last 10 years or so. Yeah, I've been deeply concerned. I'll share my concerns with you with some evidence. Yeah. First, yeah, just the basic facts. Manufacturing sector, it contributes 17 to 18% of GDP, employing about 11% of workers in the country. A dualistic structure, like rest of the economy. And factory and corporate sector employs about 30% of industrial workers, produces about 2/3 of value added. The rest working in unorganized sector, informal sector. A sizable proportion of household enterprises employ family labor. In fact, household sector's share is still pretty large in India, about 30 to 40% in the informal sector. In 2019, India was world's 5th largest industrial nation, producing 3.3% of global value added. China was number 1 with 25.5%. China, the US, and Japan are the top 3 industrialized nations. They account for 52.5% of global manufacturing value added. Yeah. India is at the bottom of industrializing nations. In 1991, before the liberal reform started, India was a positive outlier among industrializing nations. There is a paper by Raghuram Rajan and others. Okay. However, by 2016, India was at the bottom among industrialized nations. It has remained so even in 2020. India's manufacturing gross value added to GDP share is lower than the world average of 16%. Okay. This ratio is half of China's. Okay. Yeah, I think India is deindustrializing. Therefore, we need a clear definition of it. There is no globally accepted definition, but this is the most accepted working definition everywhere. So I take Daniel Roderick's definition of premature deindustrialization. I quote, in most of these countries, that is developing countries, manufacturing began to shrink or is on the course of shrinking at levels of income that are a fraction of those at which advanced economies started to deindustrialize. These developing countries are turning into service economies without having gone through a proper experience of industrialization, Roderick 2015. Many Latin American and African countries prematurely deindustrialized since the early 1980s after the third world debt crisis in 1982, embracing market-oriented reforms or Washington consensus, often under the tutelage of the IMF and the World Bank. Asia, by and large, progressed with industrialization, starting with Japan over a century ago, and it is currently going on in Vietnam and Bangladesh. What about India? Okay. Is India getting deindustrialized? Yes, I contend. Okay. There are 2 graphs here. First graph shows the share of manufacturing value added in GDP, which is stagnated around 15% by the old GDP series, around 17-18% by the new GDP series, but is nevertheless stagnating. The right hand graph is more serious. It has 2 graphs. One is the bar graph shows the share of agriculture in total employment, and the line graph shows the share of manufacturing in total employment. Manufacturing employment share declined from 12.6% in 2011-12 to 11.4% in 23-24. Correspondingly, in agriculture, agriculture share increased from 42.5% in 2018-19 to 46.1% in 23-24. This I see as clear signs of deindustrialization. This is reminiscent. I am not sure the exact magnitudes may not match yet, but something similar to what Professor Bakshi showed about deindustrialization during the early 19th, late 19th and early 18th and 19th centuries. Okay, so I'm very uneasy about these trends when I see this. Are we getting back somewhere else? That's my concern. Okay. Decline in manufacturing output and growth rate. The left-hand graph shows the GDP annual manufacturing GDP growth rate from 2001 to 2023. You find that there is a clear deceleration in growth rate over 2 decades, especially in the in the 2010s. In the first decade, in fact, it was growing faster. In second decade, it's gone down. I think in the first decade, the growth rate was around 8.2% per year. In the second decade, that is 2010s, it is 4.5% or so. Okay, so this is for me a cause of concern. And correspondingly, export to GDP ratio, I mean the share of goods, share of manufactured goods in export to GDP ratio has in fact declined. Okay, and of course, the mirror image of it is rising the services exports. Okay. Here, this is a very critical graph from my point of view. I mean, the left-hand graph shows GDP growth rate and fixed investment growth rate as per two different series of accounts. One is the national accounts series, and other is the annual survey of industries. Some of you may recall in the last decade we had a huge debate on the validity of the official GDP estimates. I had contended that the official GDP estimates are overestimated. At that time it was speculative, but now with the ASI data available for a comparable period, I have a definitive evidence which is reported on the left-hand side of the graph. You see that as per national accounts, during 2010s, the growth rate is 6.2% per year. As per ASI, it is 3.5%. The figures are more stark with respect to GFCF, that is gross fixed capital formation. As per national accounts, it is 4.5% per year, whereas as per ASI, it is 0.3% or practically zero. If you take the net, in net terms, it's even horror figures. I will not show you that. Okay, so this see blue line is the national account series. The orange line is the ASI series. The first two bars are GVA, gross value added in real terms, and the next set of two bars is the GFCF, gross fixed capital formation in real terms. Okay, and the second, yeah, this is my cause of concern. See, why policymakers are probably misled to think that industry is doing very well is because, in my view, they are misled by the wrong barometer they have been following. Okay, and this is the thing which I had flagged in 2015 when I had flagged the problems with the GDP estimation. Okay. Next, labor-intensive work has declined. In fact, if you look at textiles, which form 9.8% of total exports in 2011-12, has declined to 7.6% by 22-23. Okay. On the other hand, we are importing labor-intensive services. Though we claim to have all the technology and all the skilled labor, engineers, okay, 90% of MRO, that is maintenance and research of repair work organizations, they are all spent outside. In the sense, 90% of aircrafts of Indigo are sent outside the country for repairs and maintenance, which is the most labor-intensive part of any manufacturing. Okay. Fine. India now is an import-dependent economy. Okay, between 2005 and 6 and 21-22, India's imports from China rose 7 times in nominal dollar terms, while its exports increased by merely 2 times. Between 2018 and 24, trade deficit with China has steadily gone up. It accounts for 1/3 of India's total trade deficit. Import dependence on China seems to be structural. Dependence is not only for goods and surprisingly for Chinese skilled labor as well. Okay. During COVID, I'm done? During COVID, India launched Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan to restrict Chinese imports. But soon India had to tuck its tail and reverse many restrictions as they throttled domestic production, because a lot of what we import are intermediate goods. Okay, this is the same thing what I said. You see the blue lines are the India's exports to China, the orange lines are imports to China, and the line graph is the trade deficit with China. Okay. Okay. Why Indian industry got hollowed out? Okay. India took its eyes off industrialization, pursuing let me use the popular term called LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization after 91. Why was the neglect inevitable or necessary to overcome the 91 BOP crisis? Why I'm asking this question is, when reforms happened, everybody said there's no option, Tina. Okay? Was it true? No. Probably not. China also followed LPG, but they never gave up industrialization. Don't believe me, read Barry Norton's book. It's a full book on China's industrial policy. It's available free of cost on the online on the net. Okay, Barry Norton, one of the most distinguished China experts in the US. Okay, it opened up the foreign trade, capital, and technology strategically, not unilaterally. When China embraced liberalization in 1978, the size of its industry was roughly the same as India's, and technologically it was at the same level I'm quoting Ashok Parthasarathy, who was a very distinguished scientist and an engineer, and I think he was a very close China watcher. Okay? After 4 decades, China has stolen the march. India seems to have become a dependent development nation with sizable imports of fertilizers, active pharmaceutical ingredients, phones, and capital goods. Perhaps, here I'm sticking my neck out, it is perhaps getting closer to the Latin American model of dependent development as outlined by Cardoso in 1978. Okay? I start with the aggregate numbers. Declining savings investment rates. This is not a short-term 1 or 2 years fluctuations. It's a decade or over a decade long decline in savings investment rate. This is the official numbers. Okay? On the right side, you have the industry disaggregation. Sorry, the numbers may be small. You may not be able to see it. You take my word. Okay? The manufacturing share in total fixed investment was 19% in 2011-12. It has gone down to 18.5% in 21-22. Okay. Okay. India's recent industrial policies, Make in India 2014, aimed at raising manufacturing sector share in GDP to 25% by 24, create 100 billion additional jobs in this sector. At that time, manufacturing employment was 60 million. Okay. Policy was a revised version of National Manufacturing Policy in 2011, but which was never implemented. Okay. Atmanirbhar Bharat, Self-Reliance 2020, responding to the growing Chinese threat, the policy sought to raise domestic production of crucial intermediate inputs and restrict Chinese imports. As I mentioned, nothing happened out of that. Okay. Production-linked incentives 2022, subsidy for domestic production of 14 critical industrial goods such as mobile phones, EV batteries, capital goods, etc. Okay. What has happened? Nothing much. There's a lot of chest thumping about India becoming an exporter of mobile phones. I think that's a very spurious number because phones might have gone up, exports, but correspondingly the inputs have also gone up. Yeah, here is the, okay, before that let me say, why did Make in India fail? Because we followed a long target of trying to improve our ease of doing business index. Okay, while India has improved its ease of doing business index, but our growth rate plummeted, investment plummeted. Here is the graph. Okay, why EDB failed us? Because EDP is internationally is a bogus index. Okay, it is politically motivated index. Okay, much hype about success of mobile phone export. You see the left-hand graph, the light blue line. You see that exports of mobile phone has gone up. Okay, imports have come down, and this is what the government often shows when they say success of PLI. But look at the right-hand side graph. Look at the bars below the horizontal line. You see net imports of electronic components has gone up equally, which means that we have substituted import of final product mobile phones with intermediate inputs with very low value addition. The best work on this so far is Dr. Chidambaram, who is sitting here. Okay, on this. Okay. What about FDI? There's a lot of hype about India getting a lot of FDI, and a lot of leftists are also very worried that India is being swarmed by FDI, which is not true. Okay, export to ratio of net exports to net to gross FDI has been declining, which means that lot of exports, lot of FDI is going back immediately. Why? Because lot of FDI today is private equity. Private equity by definition doesn't invest in fixed capital. They operate in the stock market, they'll exit the country when the stock market is booming. Okay? So in the last 4 years, the stock market is booming, you see the ratio is going down. Okay? So they exit when it's opportune time to quit the markets. Okay? And they don't create physical assets. Okay? They only play in the stock market. And second graph on the right side shows that greenfield investment has been plummeting, which means basically we are allowing foreign firms to come and acquire Indian factories, firms, and brand names. You know, the Anchor, the most common switch brand, it has been taken over by a Japanese company. I'm done. Okay, I'm done with this. Okay, what are the solutions? IP industrial policy should, solution in my view, if we require a credible industrial policy, IP's objective should be to create dynamic comparative advantage and create domestic capabilities, first to retake the domestic market and then to compete globally. India has to look beyond tariffs and subsidies for production, like PLI, to promote learning. Okay? It calls for massive investment, technology upgradation, and R&D. Infrastructure shouldn't be highways to nowhere or promote rentier income from real estate, which is what is happening. In fact, there's a new good paper by Preeti Sampath of Ambedkar University where she has documented this. Our whole real estate, our infrastructure development is creating rentier economy, not a manufacturing economy. Okay? That capital-intensive industry requires long-term capital at low interest rates with performance conditions. It calls for a development financial institutions. We have created one in 2021, but that is hardly taken off. Just one last stage, let me finish. Okay? India needs to promote greenfield investment, not takeover and acquisition of Indian factories and firms by private equity firms. Okay? India needs foreign investment and technology policies to create industry technology specific roadmaps for indigenization. Okay? India needs to reverse its decline in R&D to match China. All this calls for what I call a developmental state, not a market friendly state, a euphemism for hands-off approach to industrialization. I summarize. Okay? India is deindustrializing, in my view, prematurely. Getting increasingly dependent on China, a strategic threat. India seems to be moving away from the Asian model of development towards the Latin American pattern of dependent development. This is my fear. Okay? What should India do? Align trade and industrial policies to correct for inverted duty. For example, correct for inverted duty structures. Okay? Boost fixed investment growth to reach 40% of GDP by 2030. Because no country in the world has industrialized without, this is one of the stylized facts of development, that no country has become industrialized without attaining a fixed investment rate of 40% of GDP over a sustained period. Okay. Step up local industry-specific industrial infrastructure to support MSMEs. Public investment in strategic industries, infuse life into the DFI, and all this calls for a well-designed and well-coordinated industrial policy. Thank you.
Yeah, may I ask Pulak Mishra to make his comments? Just 1 second, I wanted to say one thing, what you said, was exactly what Raj was talking about in the alternative patterns, that the economic emphasis by possibilities of industrial exports in which some primary producing countries have comparative advantage. So going to those types of industry, that's what he had said.
Thank you, ma'am. It's in fact a great opportunity for me to be here and comment on an excellent paper written by Professor Nagaraj. In fact, I'm thankful to the conference organizers, including the director of CDS, for giving me this opportunity. The paper basically talks about how or why there is a need for making some changes or revisiting the industrial policies to arrest the problem of industrial decline or relative stagnation. So broadly the paper divides the entire period into two sub-periods covering the years from 2001 to 2011-12 and then the subsequent years up to 2022-23. The paper basically hints at the policy failures in boosting the industrial growth, and it talks about how we can achieve comparative advantage, and then make some policy suggestions in respect of, say, boosting fixed investment, then development of location-specific industries, infrastructure, then providing technology support to MSMEs, and also supply of long-term credit at a low and a stable interest rate. While all these suggestions are very, very important for boosting the growth of the industry sector, I just tried to understand the insights from the paper by revisiting some of the facts and figures. So what I did, I computed some of the indicators on my own, leaving aside the abnormal years following COVID-19. So what I did, I left 1 year in between the global financial crisis and say 2010-11. So I have taken one subperiod from 2000-2001 till 2008-9, and then from 2010-11 till 2019-20. And the figures are very interesting, in fact. If we look at, or if we simply talk at, say, boosting industrial growth in Indian context requires more of public investment, that is definitely true. To crowding in private investment, public investment is a precondition. But at the same time, we should also think of how to enhance the willingness and ability of the firms to reinvest. So what kind of incentive mechanisms can be created, how to enhance their capabilities to invest? So when we look at the financial performance of the firm, it is a matter of serious concern. In fact, the profitability has declined in the, if I compare the two subperiods, in respect of our returns on capital employed, it has gone down. In respect of returns on asset, that has also gone down. So probably the firms are not finding enough incentive to reinvest. Those are already there in the sector. And it is also possible that the capabilities of the firms that is going down for reinvestment. But at the same time, there are certain positive aspects. Professor Nagaraj talked about declining greenfield investment in total, as a ratio of GDP. But I just recomputed the figure in terms of share of mergers and acquisitions in total FDI inflows. And that is showing a declining trend. That means within total FDI itself, mergers and acquisitions. So how much FDI is coming through M&H? So what I saw is that within total FDI inflows, share of M&A, it has gone down. That means that of greenfield investment, that is going up. But of course, if we standardize it by GDP, probably it will have a declining trend, as Professor Nagaraj has shown. Another concern is basically increasing cost intensity. It has increased if I compare the two subperiods. Third is decreasing import of capital goods. But at the same time, this decreasing import of capital goods, it is not being matching with increasing R&D, in-house R&D intensity. So there is a technology gap in terms of technology acquisition, technology development, and also technology adoption. The other very important concern is increasing outsourcing of manufacturing jobs and services, which is against vertical integration. Professor Nagaraj's paper talked about widening the value addition activities, developing the value chains. While that is very important, outsourcing of manufacturing jobs and services, it is showing an increasing trend. But then again, there are some other positive sides, particularly in respect of increase in export intensity. If I standardize export of final goods by total value of sales in Indian manufacturing, it is showing an increasing trend. So there are certain concerns. Also, there are certain positive aspects. So the question is how to convert the positive aspects into opportunities and how to address the potential concerns. So to my understanding, if I talk about performance of firms, then obviously there are two aspects. One is either the firms should have enough scope to exercise monopoly power, which is not possible because of different regulations. At the same time, there is another opportunity basically to enhance the efficiency. So increasing efficiency again requires adoption of technology, particularly the modern technologies. So I think this paper has immense insights to relook at the policies, but at the same time, I think the policies should be thought at different levels. It should have enough understanding of the regional dynamics, because we have state level policy interventions, we have state level incentive structures, then how to match that with central level policies and incentives. Second one is understanding the industry-wise dynamics. Third very important aspect is the macro policies, how to integrate industrial policies with macro policies, because Professor Nagaraj's paper talks more about the supply side dynamics, but then how to create effective demand. And for that, fiscal policy would be very, very important, not only for creating demand, but also for creating investment opportunities, and also in providing incentives. The third very important aspect is strengthening the intersectoral linkages, particularly linking agriculture and industry and widening the agri-value chains. That will probably give enough scope to industry sector, particularly the small and medium enterprises. And the last point is industrial policies. If I go back to the work of Bain, the structure, conduct, performance framework, and subsequent development by Tirol, I feel policies and regulations should also have important insights from farm level dynamics, particularly the strategic responses of the farms. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for a very, very insightful comment, I must say. You sort of tore into Nagaraj's data and tried to get something out of it. And very useful comments were made on Nagaraj's thing. May I now ask Keshav Das to speak on MSMEs in India, a policy critique.
Thank you, everyone, and particularly Professor Veeramani for this very unique opportunity. I should not say I'm nervous, but I feel very happy. I feel very proud to be speaking to an audience which includes some of my most revered teachers, some of my most revered seniors, and great friends over the decades. So I'm sort of talking about one particular sector which is so very, it's not moving. So I should be moving a little fast because of the paucity of time, and this is a sector that for a long, long time, I mean, way back in 1938 as part of the National Planning Committee, much before we got independence. So we have been focusing on this sector largely in terms of a major source of generating local income and local employment, in particular across varieties of skill, education, and age levels. And this also was hoped that maybe if you were to focus on this sector, it might dissuade what you may call as a distress migration from the rural to the urban areas, and also might be a source of local innovation. And what kind of official statistics we have on a sector which is sort of omnipresent, and we talk so much about that. And we have a policy history of this sector which probably is absolutely matchless. For decades we have been talking about this. The official statistics tells us something like this: a large number of products, more than 8,000 products, and whatever 111 million people engaged in this contributes about 8% of GDP, and this is one sector which is doing very well. But then one small thing we must be very clear about this MSMEs, the particular micro, small and medium enterprises. The medium category was introduced in 2006 in October officially. Otherwise it was known as the small scale enterprises, but the fact still remains that this has been very, very overtly dominated by the micro enterprises. Something like 99% of the first M is what is the most dominant component of MSME. So when we're talking about this sector, any policy intervention that you might be wondering what to do about this sector, you just can't miss out on those large number of micro enterprises, many of which are sort of based in rural areas and maybe sort of often operating from spaces which are not the designated spaces to manufacture. So these are sort of like mostly home-based. And this is the kind of data we have as we are speaking in 2024 about a sector which is the engine of growth of this country. The latest official statistics we have is as recent as 2006-07, and that is something speaks volumes about what kind of policy emphasis we have given to this. And if you go by the definitions across the globe, I mean, it is very often sort of either sort of focused on the employment or turnover, but we for a long, long time till 2020 went in for a very, very strange way of defining this very significant sector by sort of calling what you sort of thought that is going by the historical value of investment in plant and machinery. And this is how we have been sort of changing the definition over the years. And now, right now, we have come with another. In 2020, we came with a new definition where sort of we have taken both investment in plant and machinery and annual turnover, which I think is highly problematic definition. And in terms of the official information that you have, like even if you are taking like investment limits, so you find in a large number of states which are sort of shown in red, so more than 90% of the enterprises have investment limit of less than 5 lakhs. And initially we thought at least less than 25 lakh would be the limit. And so that means you have a huge, huge presence of extremely micro enterprises all over the state. And what kind of official statistics that we have, I'll spend a little while on this. And from 1990 till 2006, till when the medium category was introduced, the official statistics, the ministry data, annual reports, their websites tell you that for all these, whatever, 17, 18 years, that this sector has been growing at a providential rate of 4.07%. And no one was watching, and all the policymakers, all the academics would not look at this figure that for 18 years, a sector like MSME is growing exactly at the exactly 4.07%. And later, when the medium category was introduced, particularly from 2015-16 till today, the number of units have remained 63.39 million, and the number of people engaged remain exactly 110.99 from 2015 till 2024. That is the official statistics. And if I sort of go by the official statistics and plot the growth rates of a sector in which we take so much of pride, it is very sad to say that there's very little has happened. In fact, I would sort of imagine by official statistics from 2015-16, the growth rate has been just 0. And the other sort of formalizing efforts to introduce a kind of a platform where actually the small enterprises could register. There has been very, very little information about this, in detailed information, and we also know that just about 23-24% they have sort of formally registered, and many of them are in the services domain, and very few manufacturing enterprises are available. The other thing is partly what Nagaraj probably was referring to. I think in terms of our sort of world-class production in this sector, if you go by the dollar value of exports, so there have been massive fluctuations over the decades. So this is not a sector in which we have been doing very well. And so the export data, which the last sort of detailed export data we got was from 2007-8. So it's very sad that we do not have sort of detailed sector-wise, product-wise export data from this sector after 2007-8. And that again shows that just about 7 or 8 broad product groups accounting for something like 85% of the total export. So what kind of persisting constraints this sector faces? And of course, the finance is a big issue. And again, sort of you see the formal sources, there has been a massive decline in the share of MSMEs in non-food credit. in terms of the share of private sector advances, there has been a decline. And the other thing, like which sort of was introduced in 2015, the Mudra scheme sort of meant and sort of giving about 10 lakh so working capital loan to the smaller or the micro enterprises. There has been a kind of very interesting trend in terms of the number of accounts and the amount disbursed. There has been a rise, but there is also a cause of concern that the average loan size has also been growing, sort of essentially suggesting that the very, very small units within the micro category probably are not accessing the loan which is available to them. And there have been serious issues relating to infrastructure for this sector, and in a large scale study that we have done in India for the Ministry of Industry, one of the major issues related to what kind of sort of transport networks we had, what about the CETPs, water and varieties of issues which are in reservation, that is again. So I'll just go a little fast. And the other thing which, so relating to the small scale enterprises was a huge expectation from what we thought would be happening through the cluster development, which was introduced in 1997. But then, so very sadly, the MSMEs, which are essentially a sectoral idea, the cluster actually sort of encompasses both a sector and a spatial dimension. And in our sort of focus on cluster development, there was still a continuation of what we may call as a subsectoral approach, and there is very little we did in terms of sort of doing something to the space in terms of making investments in certain kinds of business infrastructure. And then we had this great idea. This is something which came from JETRO, the Japanese External Trade Organization. This is a kind of a new way of sort of promoting small enterprises through what is sort of described as the flowchart approach to industrial cluster policy. Essentially, you have sort of anchor firms or lead firms, which are essentially Japanese firms, who would be sort of setting their base to manufacture sort of components and parts in this very well-known DMIC, the Delhi-Mumbai Industry Corridor. But that also ensures that the scrutiny process is so strong that a large number of micro and small enterprises in India will not be eligible to participate in their production process. And once these big companies sort of leave, as they left in Thailand, as they left in Philippines, as they left in China, for varieties of cultural reasons often, our small enterprises who might be sort of working for them might be left in the lurch. So for the paucity of time, I'll just quickly take you through some of the small enterprise clusters. And I thought, let me start with the ceramic cluster of Morbi in Gujarat, the study I did along in a huge project by Nagaraj. So this is a very, very interesting sort of like approach to promoting small enterprises, sort of which there are a lot of emphasis given much beyond the subsector itself, in fact. Yeah. And so there has been sort of focus like in this place called Morbi, which is in fact producing the maximum number of whatever the ceramic tiles in terms of since 2014. The imports from China actually has declined because Morbi has taken over. And this has happened because of a variety of interventions, including sort of building a kind of a road network from this cluster of ceramic units to the Kandla port. So these are so you have to really think much beyond the subsector itself, and then of course these are sort of products from that cluster. And in a very small place, with state support, with the industry association taking a lead role, it is very much possible that it is not just the working capital loan, it is not the mudra. Very often we think that the small enterprise, if you give them some bank loans, I think it's going to solve the problem. I think that's extremely myopic way of looking at policy. And sort of I take you to the next sort of kind of a rural cluster, if you like, sort of like manufacturing what is known as the Kolhapuri chappals for a long, long time. And despite the presence of the Central Leather Research Institute and varieties of state government initiatives, it is actually a kind of a private NGO called Ascent, which sort of made huge intervention there by introducing certain kinds of mechanization and also sort of going in for process innovations. And in a cluster like this, the same people who have been sort of into a traditional manufacturing strategy, so the people who are sort of making Kolhapuri chappals, so they have come up with something like more than 600 new designs and exporting to more than 40 countries. It is quite possible that you have to really think about product and process innovation, not just the bank loans, please. That's not the way. And sort of that takes me to another sort of like a polluting cluster, if you like. I'm just giving some examples. I've done so many field work in India. So this is from Odisha, and this is a kind of a stone crushing cluster of more than 1,000 such units are there. And so as you can see, absolutely unscientific ways of mining and crushing the stone. So this has polluted local water bodies, it has polluted air, it has led to huge out-migration of people from here. And but at the same time, there is the Central Pollution Control Board sort of introduces a kind of a technology, green technology, as you often say. So this is the green technology that you are seeing, a little pipe there, and it's more like a shower, and when sort of like as the stone is crushed and as the dust emanates from there, so this sort of the showers should normally be working as sort of dunking that dust there. But then as you do a field survey there, sort of you find that not a single unit is in fact using. So their simple point is that these are informal units, and if they are sort of spending on introducing the green technology, which means that they have to spend on electricity, diesel, and on water, it might actually increase their sort of unit cost. So there have been issues like this which we need to focus on. So there are we are sort of wondering whether it is weak market institution infrastructure, whether that is what has sort of acted as a disincentive to innovate in this sector so that you could have probably accessed a better market. Is that the issue? Or we have to have seen it more as a livelihood-centric issues, or particularly if you focus on the craft sector or the rural sector. So these are we talking about promoting what we may describe as subsistence industrialization? If that is the focus, we are not going to do as much as, let's say, countries in Asia, for instance, in Thailand, in Japan, they have done through one village, one product, or one tambon, one product, sort of ideas by which they have introduced varieties of incentive schemes, both by the state and non-state actors. They have engaged the Thai Airways, for instance, the Thai embassies, to promote their goods from the rural areas in the global market. So there have been sort of varieties of ways to learn from the Asian countries. And then, of course, I'll go a little fast here. And so these are the few last points. So what should be done? So we must one of the first things that we must do is that we must go in for the MSME census. That has to be done immediately. If you want to know anything about that sector, we must bifurcate or trifurcate the micro, which sort of accounts for more than 99%. And of course, we should focus on the demand side issues and the labor question, particularly because these are largely in the informal domain. That still requires a lot of attention. So what I suggest is endogenous transformation of space, which includes investment in sort of developing business infrastructure, supporting product and process innovations. These are the areas in which sort of we have to focus, and maybe we create certain categories on the basis of markets, on the basis of technology, and not just talk in terms of providing a little banking support, providing a little finance to large number of enterprises which are in the domain of informality. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. To begin with, I must thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to discuss Professor Das' paper on the issues of MSMEs. Professor Das, thank you for your insightful paper on the challenges facing by the MSMEs in India. MSMEs are crucial for generating the employment and income at local level, second to the agriculture sector in providing the jobs. Professor Das' paper touches on several issues regarding the data availability, accuracy and financing, exports, infrastructure and the innovation. The paper also brings the issues of the informality within the MSMEs, as many of the large number of the micro enterprises are remain unregistered and as a result don't have access to the formal support system. This is more apparent in the during the time of COVID-19 pandemic, when the large number of the informal business were struggled the most and had to shut down. Professor Das highlights the implications of the change in the MSME definition in July 2020, I guess. that shifting from the investment-oriented definition to the investment and the turnover, including the definition, largely skewed towards the benefiting the large enterprises compared to the micro and marginalized small enterprises. Udyam registration portal, which has been initiative of the government, also helped the some of the MSMEs to register, but it seems like your data is revealing that largely service sector enterprises are registering in the Udyam registration portal, maybe leaving the manufacturing MSMEs underrepresented. So it's essential to ensure that registered firms accessing the governmental benefits like loans and export support to foster the inclusive ecosystem for all MSMEs. A key concern highlighted by the Professor Das is outdated and incomplete data on the MSMEs, as the paper relies more on the MSME census of 2006 and 7 and the NSSO of 2015 and 16. Although the latest NSSO has released the unincorporated enterprise survey of 2021-22 and 22-23, and the World Bank enterprise survey also released the informal sector enterprises, and census also 2013-14 till 6th economic census is available, and of course the points, the issues raised by the Professor Das related to the data availability and accuracy, even though the latest data released are still relevant, because no problem. Since many of the these latest released data sets also do not cover the data related to the exports, innovation, and especially related to the production networks of MSMEs. And as Professor Das is highlighted, that financial access remains the big issue for the MSMEs. The share of MSME loans in total credit is declining, and the Mudra schemes growing average loan size suggests that the larger business are benefiting more than the smaller and the micro ones. And even the latest NSSO survey reveals that the MSMEs often face limited access to the financial resources and largely dependent on the informal sources, such as taking loans and from the friends and the relatives, and the so the financial inclusion of informal sector enterprises and MSMEs are crucial given the potential of digital transformation to foster the inclusive economic development. Professor Das highlights that the MSMEs, Professor Das highlights that the MSMEs have significantly contributed to the India's exports, ranging from 20 to 50% over the years, but the performance of the MSME is still decreasing. This reveals the facts that there is a data lack of the disaggregate level of the MSMEs, especially on the global production networks and the export and labor intensive sectors. And the paper also emphasized the importance of the infrastructure, electricity and transport for fostering the innovations. However, the poor infrastructure prevents the MSMEs, especially in the rural areas, from innovation and competence building. The critical point that deserves attention here is that the latest annual survey of unincorporated enterprises survey 21-22 and 22-23, which introduced the royal receipts and the royal payments as a new indicators. However, it's out. It's publicly available. So, however, when I looked into this royal payments and the royal receipts, only less than 0.1% of the firms are having the royal payments, and out of the 63 million firms, very few firms, around 700 or 800 firms, are having a royal receipts. So this indicates that formal metrics like royal payments and intellectual properties focus largely on the formal sector enterprises. They often miss the innovation practices of the informal firms. In the informal MSMEs, innovations happens differently than the formal sector enterprises, like by learning by doing activities, imitations and adaptations, and especially locally driven solutions that that needs in data collection, innovation data collection for the informal firms. So Professor Das presented a clear, urgent case for the reforming MSMEs policies in India. There is a need for more inclusive and data-driven approaches that recognize the diversity within the MSME sector, particularly in terms of informal sector enterprises. To wind up, Professor Das highlights there is an urgent need for the governments to conduct the new economic census of MSMEs with the updated data is crucial for identifying the trends and the issues faced by the MSMEs. And the cluster development is also a key approach in boosting the growth of MSMEs by fostering the collaboration, innovation and knowledge sharing. Thank you.
much, Dr. Chandrasekhar. Actually, what I had wanted was that each of the, we had two very wonderful presentations, really, and so relevant now. So I really wanted each one first to respond to the discussant, because the discussant also does a lot of work, but somehow gets left out in the whole process of no time. But I find the time is 10:30 already. So 10 minutes. Okay, then I'll open it to the floor, and then you all can include some comments to be answered. So it's open to the floor now to ask questions to either of them. Please come, Nagaraj. Yeah. And Pulak and Chandrasekhar.
Shall I ask the question? Yes? Can I ask the question? This is to Professor Nagaraj. By considering the fact that nearly 50 or slightly more than 50% of teenagers don't complete school education even today, I'm talking about 10 years or 12 years of school education, and the female work participation rate, the low female work participation rate, and if you compare it with the completion rate in China and the female work participation rate in China, the share of workforce who is willing or who is capable to be factory workers, let me put it in that sense, factory workers in India is substantially lower than that in China, but also in Vietnam and even Thailand, or even some countries like Indonesia. How do you look at the connection between this possible education failure in India and its manufacturing development?
I'm just thinking whether maybe we take one or two more questions for Nagaraj, and then he answers them together. Otherwise, who's that? Okay, Chiranjeev. I must not be discriminating, so please put up your hands nicely, because I see your hands. So Chiranjeev and Arjun.
This is a question for Professor Nagaraj. Nagaraj, thanks for a very excellent presentation. But the one thought that is obviously was, you couldn't bring it in here, but can we really talk about the whole industrial dynamic without talking about what's happening to industrial structure? That is to say, I'm now talking overtly about crony capitalism, overtly about the formation of conglomerates and how they function, and whether or not it's actually affecting the whole, because the big-small divide in the Indian industrial scene is very, very big. So in what way does it reflect upon what you have said?
One more question for him, and then I call him first.
I think this is related to Professor Shanmuga's question. And when we look at the why India derailed on industrialization, I think the discussion is more on proximate policies like tariff protection or recently PLI, all these things. But I think much more deeper fact is our failure in education, and that is why, and recently, I think 2 months back, government eased the visa regulation to Chinese workers. It means that we are not having enough qualified or technicians in India. So that is the one. Then second thing, another factor which is also not ignored is that is also remotely related. A deeper factor is the increasing inequality. When you look at the industrial experience of late Korea or other countries, there's more or less equal society. They also give a lot of importance to education. In India, though we are in number of, we are more population, but the demand for many household items like refrigerator, TV or two-wheeler, that is not very high because many people are not cannot afford to buy these things. So though it is a bigger country in terms of population, what is our market? Now the issue is that whether we can compete in the international market, the early stage of industry, because when we start producing, many commodities are of very low quality. Usually the domestic market help us to save. But now we have to compete with other countries also. So how do you, these deeper factors I think needs to be considered. I think, what is your view on this thing? That is the question. Okay, thank you.
No one else that I'll ask you to answer. Any other woman?
There's a room. No, there's a male person there who's asking. Yes, please.
Sir, Short question, like regarding that, this result of this Atmanirbhar Bharat kind of this thing policies, is it purely an economic policy question or is a socio-economic question? Because like, are we that much open or ready to accept that kind of investment or industrial environment here to attract investment when foreign capitalists or foreign companies?
Thank you. Yeah, the two. Yeah. Okay, let me first answer this. Okay, no, then the two questions regarding education. I agree, education is a problem. But my question is that when there is think about IT revolution, okay? India created IT, I mean, we had engineers, but they were not fully, I would say, employment ready. Okay, but India invested heavily in creating, I know what to say, job-ready workers by creating a whole lot of institutions. We expanded our IITs, IIMs, and created a separate category called triple IITs. Okay, there are 21 of them in the country. Okay, all this was done. Okay, and then we had the IT revolution. So government took initiative to do this. Why are we not doing anything with respect to labor-intensive manufacturing services? Our ITs, wherever government is not serious, they would say, give it to PPP, which will never take off in the education. Okay, and similarly, there's been, the skill development. When you know that government doesn't want to invest it, you say invite private sector to put in money, which is again never going to take off. In fact, okay, so therefore it is lack of government interest in it. Why? I think the answers lie in political economy. Okay, did we? And secondly, I have no problem. I have no problem in inviting foreign workers with a clear mandate. Look, I mean, as it has happened historically from the times of the Japanese. Now look, when you invite foreign workers, you have a system of observing the tacit knowledge. Okay, and do we have any system like that? Nothing. So this is complete callousness because India, the present government or present regime, they are not bothered about labor intensive or manufacturing sector. The whole emphasis is on IT and financial sectors. That's my problem. Okay. So education, see, we are not bothered. I'm not talking about the general level of education, which is already you know what it is. Okay. But when there is when it involves what was it, politically powerful communities like middle class, okay, government invested and created IT revolution, but government is not equally interested in creating labor-intensive jobs. Fine, that's my answer. I think your question about crony capitalism, I have addressed it. In fact, some of it is there in my larger paper which I have circulated. Anyway, I have a larger version of this paper. I can share it with you. Thank you.
What about?
Sorry. Pullaks, I mean, I wish I had the written comments to.
We'll do it later.
Right.
So there is no time. I'm sorry, so much effort is taken by the discussants. Yeah. I feel more comfortable here. So anyone now to ask Keshav? Please quickly, because we have just 2-3 questions we can take.
Sir, in your presentation, you already mentioned that the support of MSMEs are mostly into giving finance and subsidies. Apart from that, when we go to the ground, like when we directly talk to these MSMEs, many MSMEs get into trouble because of lack of their managerial effectiveness. I mean, how can we institutionalize the support of this managerial effectiveness to this MSME support systems in the country?
Why no women are asking, I see?
Actually, this is related to both the presentations. So, adding on the remarks of Dr. Parameswaran's question on a lack of markets, do you still think there is a relevancy for, Dr. Raj used to discuss, Professor Raj used to discuss on these things related to land reforms which will increase the rural demand and aid in the demand for industrial products, which also helped in promoting MSMEs in Kerala and both West Bengal as well. So do you think this is still relevant policy today?
Yeah. There's another question by Geeta.
Keshav, this is actually just for a clarification. I'm a little confused about the question of whether finance is no longer a problem for MSMEs, or is it? Because my understanding was that it has been a problem and then the problem became acute after demonetization. And has never recovered. So can you clarify, because I think otherwise, because you focused on all the other barriers, and the question that just came before almost seemed to suggest that, this is something that's okay and everything else is fine.
Just to continue with the point raised by Geeta, I haven't heard much of the shocks, demonetization, GST, and then 2019-20, even before COVID, the sort of crisis that we had. And all of this, my understanding, casual talk tells us that the small, the marginal, they were all very seriously affected. Now, will the 21-22 data reveal something of that? I think that would be the interesting sort of a thing. Because if I understand, for example, employment laws, whatever little that I have read, these 3-4 shocks, they virtually, even before COVID, they finished off a lot of this.
Is it all? I just have one question. Yeah, one question was to Nagaraj, of course, that regional, Kerala is trying very hard to industrialize, very hard, and they're taking a lot of steps to do it, and there's been some change in the indicators. So maybe because we have such a large service sector already. So that's one thing I said. The regional aspects have to be taken into account. Overall, what is happening is, of course, a different matter. The second thing was to Das. This whole question of innovation, obviously we don't want the crushers to remain as they are with all the dust and those horrible working conditions. So the whole question which Raj was raising at that time, how do you introduce innovation or change, technical change of some type in these sectors, without really displacing or, bringing about misery for a large number of people. So these are the sort of questions which came to my mind.
Let me clarify, because there are 2-3 questions relating to finance. At no stage, I'm saying that finance has not been significant barrier to the MSMEs. In fact, by sort of suggesting that a large proportion of these units, something like 99%, which are micro and very often in the informal sector, that itself talks about how they have been excluded systematically, despite having the priority sector lending as one of the goals of promoting this sector. The second thing is, my reference to Mudra again was like, this was also a very celebrated sort of scheme, but then, as I was sort of very quickly suggesting, that it's the relatively larger of the micro enterprises who have been accessing this. So the finance remains that, but then to reduce the whole thing, as through the Atmanirbhar program, for instance, in 2020, like we came up with a big idea that, okay, only if you sort of provide working capital support to the small enterprises. In fact, there were at least 5 different studies done by the IIT Madras, done by some agency of RBI, and several other studies, references are with me. So they suggested that several of these small enterprises did not access the money that was available to them because it involved a lot of paperwork. So there has been sort of issues like that, and the finance remains a key constraint, but at the same time, there is a large number of enterprises which are not able to access. And despite having the Udyam, that whatever portal that we have for formalizing, these are essentially, so far as I know, whatever little information I have, is mostly small little NGOs, Xerox copier machine units, and so these are the sort of like units who are sort of registered as the MSME portal, and very few in the manufacturing domain. The second little point is that we have done very little in terms of generating demand. So demand for this both at the domestic level and also finding space so that sort of you could sort of export elsewhere. So I think a paper by Ashwini Seth many years back had actually focused on this, and I think we have not really focused on the varieties of the products that we have and what kind of, like for instance, I give a very quick example of like in a place like Thailand, for instance, where they have introduced this one Tambon, one product idea. So there is a huge emphasis on packaging, for instance, like packaging, which is very closely linked to the small enterprises, but also is a kind of a support service and sort of adds value to many of the products that we have. So there are other issues, for instance, like if you are taking a large number of small enterprises or micro enterprises, which are sort of based on natural resources, let's say forest products or whatever, like horns or certain kinds of wood, certain kinds of metals. So several of these raw materials are not available to them. So despite having a huge production base, traditional base, heritage, whatever production base in which we take a lot of pride, we have done pretty little in terms of investing in like sort of creating some kind of, let's say, raw material bank, for instance, or even to do something like what China did as sort of promoting market platforms, by which the state, in fact, sort of acted as the kind of a major driver to link particularly the kind of a sort of production which was coming from the northwestern part of China, which was completely cut off from the very dynamic eastern part. So the state playing a major role, and in several places it is the industry associations or industry collectives, so they have played very significant role. So I would imagine, so I'm not sort of reducing the role of finance in MSMEs. I'm only trying to say that our institutional arrangements have been such that either they are not sort of preferring money. Even the World Enterprise Survey of 2000, both 2014 and 2022 data on India, if you sort of see that the large proportion of the enterprises who are borrowing, they're actually not going to the formal sources. They're in fact borrowing from their friends, relatives, and from money lenders. So there is some serious issue in sort of figuring out that why the small enterprise or particularly the micro enterprises are not accessing the finance. And so I think that's all I'll say now.
I think I did not answer Parmeshwar's questions about demand side, and also same question was raised here. You see, I also believe that look, demand was a problem, but look at our rising imports from China. India is the biggest importer of laptops in the world, the biggest importer of all electronics hardware. Does it show lack of demand? Because our trade and industrial policies are not synchronized. We have believed, look, if it is cheaper from China, import it. Okay, we have believed in static comparative advantage. We have never thought of creating domestic comparative advantage, dynamic comparative advantage. We have willingly given up our space. And one more thing I'll tell you, government demand. Government, in fact, this has been, look, even under WTO, there is the government procurement can have protection for domestic suppliers. It's a WTO rule. We have voluntarily given it up because we believe that import liberalization is good for us. Voluntary, this is the belief system. Okay, maybe I'm overstating my case, but think about it. Okay, this is, look, voluntary or imports. So this is what, not strategic, not a strategic trail policy, but completely open door policy is best for us in the long run. We don't know where comparative advantage lies, but we don't realize that we're systematically undermining our own domestic industry. See, in fact, I can go on and on. See, I take photographs of, just 1 minute. Okay, when I meet Bajaj Electricals fellow, He says, sir, why should I make it here when I can get cheaper from China? And why is it so? Is it because they have a cost advantage? No, it's nothing cost there. Because the way in which the costs are structured. In fact, when we did these case studies, in fact, this of which, okay, see, Borby is a case where the government gave the right incentives, they were able to perform in 3 years. In fact, when I went to 10 clusters across the country while we were doing this study, I asked associations, okay, do you find the Chinese are definitely superior to us? I mean, they are up there, we are here. He said, no, sir, we are all the same. Okay, give us the right incentives, we will do it. I mean, uniformly they said that. And again, the very, I would say, mainstream scholars or policy say, labor is a major issue. I asked across, do you find labor is an issue? Nowhere, not in a single across the country they said labor is an issue. So I think we have targeted wrong policy choices. That's my stop. I think I'll stop here.
I think, we'll close now because we are running over time. And it was really very interesting, and I think it has to be carried on outside because there are so many questions raised and they should be answered. So maybe later you can discuss it. Thank you all, and thank you so much to all of you all, the speakers and so thank you so much.
Thank you all. We'll be breaking for tea. Kindly come as fast as possible. We'll try to start the program start the next session by 11:05. Try to be here at the auditorium by 11. For the next session, Trade, Industrialization and Growth, we have Professor C. Veeramani, Director of CDS, to chair the session. Professor Sunil Mani, former Director, CDS, and Honorary Fellow is presenting the paper, Enhancing Solar Photovoltaic Technology in India, State Initiatives, Innovation and Strategic Growth. Dr. Chidambaram G. Iyer, Associate Professor, CDS, would be the discussant of the session. Professor Saikat Sinha Roy, Professor and former Head, Center for Advanced Studies, Principal Scientist for a global project on SEZs and Inequality, Jadavpur University, would present the paper, Global Value Chains and Productivity Catch-up, Evidence from Indian Firms. Professor P.L. Beena, Professor of CDS, would be the discussant for the same. Inviting you all to the dais.
Good morning. I'm very happy to chair this session. I know both of them, the speakers, very well. Professor Saikat is my very good friend, and also our areas of work overlaps, and also the workplaces overlap, because whenever I go to some conferences or part of some committees, he is always there. And then Professor Sunil Mani was my teacher when I was a student here, and he was a very helpful teacher at that time. And now, as my predecessor, as former director, and now these days in my new role, whenever I face some difficult situation, I always approach him and he gives me some useful tips on how to handle situations. So that way, I'm very happy to be sharing this session. And Professor Mani's paper is on solar photovoltaic technology. Like his usual approach and other papers that he had published, several of them, in this paper also, he undertakes a very detailed and careful analysis of a specific case study, specific industry. But at the same time, even though the title would look like it's a very narrowly focused on some specific industry, like what he generally does, it's important to keep in mind that he does it in the context of a larger framework, framework of policy changes, institutional framework, and keeping the broader context in mind, the broader picture in mind. And the broader picture is the re-emergence of industrial policy across the world, including in India, in advanced countries, etc. And also there is other broader picture like the emerging geopolitical developments, the +1 strategy, China +1 strategy that countries are talking about, and reconfiguration of global value chains. So these are the big story, big context in which he is talking about this specific industry. And this approach is truly in the spirit of Professor K. N. Raj's approach, because he always advocates careful analysis of micro data and understanding the nuances of the situation, keeping in mind the larger context. So even though it's a survey of some village or a specific case, the larger context is what is motivating to study that. So in that way, this paper by Professor Mani is truly keeping that type of a tradition at CDS. And also it is important because the industrial policy, there is a re-emergence. The data, whatever data that is available now, clearly shows that a recent re-emergence of industrial policy, and we see that a lot of that is happening in advanced countries. As against the earlier time period, it was mostly in the developing countries, which did import substitution, infant industry. But these days, we keep hearing about industrial policy much more in advanced countries. And the rationale for this industrial policy is well known to us economists. It is basically to address market failures. and also, as Professor Nagaraj mentioned, to create dynamic comparative advantage. But then one need to revisit, one need to look at whether the new industrial policy, which is now so widely prevalent in advanced countries and also in some of the developing countries, are they really addressing market failure, or is it in some context, in some way, protectionism coming back in the garb of industrial policy? So one need to look at that very carefully. And also there is a need to look at industrial policy in a more critical way, because the conventional industrial policy framework may not be suitable in the current context, because the conventional policy, industrial policy framework focuses on, for example, import controls, right? Import controls, and multinational firms are like, do not have a major role to play. It's basically you create domestic champions so that they can compete with the multinational firms. But those type of approach was done in a context in which the understanding is that production process in different industries happen within a country. It's not globally fragmented, but we know that in several industries today, production processes are globally fragmented. Parts and components come from different parts of the world. Assembly takes place somewhere else. This is what is happening in most cases. So when that is the case, then what should be the nature of industrial policy? Can we follow the same old type of industrial policy, providing trade protection, high import barriers, etc., is a question which need to be addressed. The other thing, I'll just take 1 minute. The other thing is that in the conventional industrial policy framework, export is the end goal, right? You first create the domestic market for industries through trade protection, create competitive advantage, and then encourage firms to go to the global market once they achieve competitiveness. But in the context of global value chain, it is just the reverse. Export is the starting point. You enter into the global market first, based on where your comparative advantage within the GVC lies, and then compete with and move up in the value chain, the upgrading. That is what the industrial policy should now try to achieve. So that is different from the earlier one. The third one is that in the earlier time, as I already mentioned, you promote domestic champions, domestic industries, and then enable them to compete with the multinational companies in the long run. But now multinational companies are part and parcel of your industrial policy. Like, they are the lead firms in global value chain. So some of the findings that Professor Mani is going to report is very much consistent with what I said as the underlying fact today. He finds that in his paper, even though trade barriers are imposed against Chinese goods, but Chinese imports are still continuing despite high trade barriers. He also finds that Chinese multinational companies are coming and investing in the particular industry that he is studying. So this is the larger context that I wanted to put before I inviting Professor Mani to make his presentation, and then later cite it. Thank you.
First of all, I wish to thank CDS and specifically Professor Veeramani, the director, for inviting me. This is part of a large exercise which I'm actually doing, looking at the role of state with respect to promoting and nurturing high-tech industries in a late industrializing country such as that of India. I look at the experience of pharmaceutical industry, vaccines, computer software services, space, electric vehicles, and solar photovoltaic technology. And this morning, I am actually going to present the chapter on solar photovoltaic technology. And as you said, it is a paper which is done in the context of re-emergence of industrial policy in a range of countries. And as Professor Veeramani rightly said, it is not just happening in developing countries, but also in developed countries. So you can find that even in the United States, for instance, there is now a big talk about using various kinds of industrial policy instruments. And we have already seen that in the context of developing vaccines in a very short period of time during COVID-19. Now, the way in which I'm going to structure my presentation is that I will first start with the research problem that I have in mind. I will not talk much about the analytical framework given the time constraint. And I will also not talk too much about the engagement with the past literature, because I'm just presenting this because these are the ingredients of a scientific paper. And then I will certainly talk about role of state in promoting domestic manufacturing, because it is very interesting that in this particular context, state not only at the central level, but also at the state, at the subnational level, has worked together and have a range of policies which affects both supply as well as demand. Normally what you find is that industrial policies are basically directed towards increasing the supply of a particular product or a process. But here what you find is that state policy is available for both supporting supply as well as demand. And then I look at the effectiveness of these policies, because this is very important, because policy intention is something which we all talk about, but what about the effectiveness of this? And I've got certain indicators for measuring this. And then one of the basic point about my paper is that while government policies have largely focused on trying to promote domestic manufacturing, it has not played very much role in terms of developing local technological capability. Now, local technological capability is something which has to, to follow from manufacturing, in the sense that if you want that manufacturing to be, self-sustaining and based on domestic resources, you need to have the technology. And technology is path dependent, it's cumulative. What you do today is basically dependent on what you have been doing yesterday. And if you have not been doing something yesterday, then all of a sudden jumping into a high-tech area and then trying to manufacture that here, you tend to end up as assemblers. And this is a story that I'm trying to show in the case of the solar photovoltaic cells, which I understand is a very important industry in the context of sustainable development, because in terms of our various commitments, especially the climate goals, the net zero emissions of 2070, etc., so, renewable energy sources are an important component, and within the renewable energy, solar energy much more than any other forms of green energies, like for instance wind, small hydro, generating electricity from waste materials, etc., and so on. Solar is the most important one. And within solar, the most important technology is basically the photovoltaic technology, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, generally speaking, in high technology industries, the state has to play a very important role, and this is because of two reasons. First is the very high capital requirements. So you can see that across the world, wherever you have high-tech industries, initially it has been started by the state, and slowly over time, state has actually withdrawn and given the place to the market and so on. And second is the technological complexity also requires that you need to have, so if you look at India, for instance, almost all areas of high technology were started by the state, and the state has actually directly entered by setting up a public sector enterprise and so on. Okay? But I'm not arguing that the state intervention should always be in the form of state undertaking production. The production can be undertaken by the market, but the state can provide a variety of incentives and support systems for that thing to happen. So the key role of government is in terms of facilitating the manufacturing process. So we have a range of policies, and normally when you talk about industrial policy, we narrowly define in terms of only those policies which are designed essentially to facilitate the manufacturing process in the country. But at the same time, you also need to have investment in domestic technology development, and that's given a short shrift as far as India is concerned in a range of industries. And the holistic growth requires both manufacturing capability and also local technological innovations. And in the case of solar photovoltaic technology, what you find is that the state intervention, both at the central level as well as the subnational level, both at the supply and the demand side, has been directed essentially to promote manufacturing, and very little attention has been paid to domestic technology development, excepting for sporadic attempts here and there, which I will talk about because I've gone into the details of each of the technologies which are involved in the solar photovoltaic technology. And I try to show that the local activity is almost close to zero. And as a result, there has been significant growth in manufacturing since 2012, but remains very highly import dependent. And as Nagaraj has shown also, in generally speaking, also it has been very highly import dependent. I don't go into the analytical framework, etc., and so on for want of time. But if you do an engagement with the previous literature, there are two gaps that actually one can do. These are the range of issues that have come up in the literature on solar photovoltaic technology as far as India is concerned. First of all, lack of studies on the growth and innovation performance of the solar PV industry over a period of time. So because this is an evolving industry, so technology is changing. So if you are actually talking about it at a particular point in time, you only talk about a snapshot picture. And so over a period of time, how is it becoming? But as I said, technology is cumulative and path dependent. Second gap too is most of the studies are a decade old, missing and misses some of the recent developments. So now let me start with the role of the state. And the state role is both in terms of stimulating demand. So we have a range of policies. In fact, you don't find this in many other industries where in this morning's presentation also, the point was made that demand was not looked at so much by the policies. But here in this case, you have a range of policies, both by the central government as well as the state government, to increase the demand for solar photovoltaics, both at the household level and also at the utility level. Because I must say that this technology can be used both at the decentralized level on the rooftop of your house or a building, and also at utility level where you have a company which is actually generating solar energy through photovoltaic cells. Okay, so renewable purchase obligations is the most important one which is actually there, where government has actually put some targets on the DISCOMs. DISCOMs are basically distribution companies which generate electricity. Now in Kerala, we have only the GENCO and DISCOM. GENCO is basically generating companies and DISCOM is basically distribution companies. KSEB is rolled into one. You don't have a separate distribution company. But in some states, you have distribution companies which are actually different. Anyway, the distribution companies have to buy their electricity. In 2023, for instance, the target was 24.23% of the total electricity that you procure should be from renewable sources. And within renewable sources, solar is the most important component. And this should progressively rise to about 43% by 2030. But its actual implementation of this policy in terms of compliance has been very, very varying from, across the states and so on. The next is the rooftop solar program, which has been given a major impetus quite recently because the government has been providing a very big subsidy, which accounts for about 22 to 25% of the cost of that installation. And that is supposed to promote decentralized. Now, just to give you a picture of the total amount of solar energy which is actually generated in our country, almost 75 to 80% is from utility level or centralized structures, and about 20 to 25% is from decentralized. The idea is to encourage more decentralized because there are so many households, and if the households can actually shift to solar, having it on your rooftop. For instance, when I was the director here, I tried my best to have a solar plant on top of CDS, but an organization of the government here actually dissuaded us by saying that you don't produce much, even if you were to put one. And so that is the kind of quality of institutions that we have actually put in place in terms of this rooftop solar program. Then feed-in tariff is one where the government offers a fixed premium for the amount of electricity that you have generated through solar energy. So for instance, the amount of, for instance, if you have a solar plant on your rooftop, the electricity which is generated during the daytime will actually go into your house grid first. Assume that it's a grid connected solar. Most of the things are grid connected. And then, of course, you have, what the government does is, the electricity board does is, it measures the amount of electricity which is actually exported by you and also imported by you during the night time, take the net exports, and this is put in a bank, and the bank grows, the account in the bank grows until March of the fiscal year, because, and then at the end of the, you get a big sum of money, okay? At a predetermined, that is the feed-in tariff, that policy. So that actually promotes the demand. The net metering policy is also very similar to this in the sense that import minus export, the net exports, if it is positive, then you don't have an electricity bill at all. It is zero electricity bill for you, because you have consumed much less than what you have produced. So like that, you have this range of these policies, including direct subsidies which are given and so on to increase the demand. Likewise, you have a number of policies for increasing the supply of solar photovoltaic cells. The production-linked incentive scheme is the most important one. And then, of course, the basic customs duty that the government has actually put on, or imposed on both imports of cells as well as modules. 25% on cells and 40% on modules has been imported. And then also you have a policy called, so in that way the government is actually trying to prevent the import of foreign technologies to India. And then the next policy is the approved list of models and manufacturers, in the sense that the government has identified a list of manufacturers, about 84 of them, who conform to Bureau of Indian Standard certification in module preparation, and these have been only licensed to sell modules to local consumers. So you have a range of policies which you don't find in many other industries, essentially to increase both the demand as well as supply of modules. Now, what has happened to these policies? And first, I will start with the first one. India, in 2022, if you take, India has now emerged as the third largest producer of solar photovoltaics in the world. It used to be number 8 in 2012. So over time, it has actually become number 3. Okay, so this is a great news. So you find, on X, the Minister for New and Renewable Energy congratulating, the government, etc., and saying that we have become the number 3 producer in the world, and in such a very short period of time in a very high-tech area. Okay, but if you look at the growth of installed capacity, one interesting thing happens, because this is actually a value chain that you should be talking about. You have first polysilicon, then you have wafers, then you have cells, and then you have the modules. Okay? So now, if you take the cells and modules, then what you find is that in cells, our installed capacity is only 5.8 gigawatts, and in modules, we have 64.5, so almost like 10 times. Okay? So and the modules are the ones which are actually purchased by you and me for putting up plants. So which means that much of the solar modules that we will be buying will be imported from abroad, because the cell capacity is not there, and cell capacity is not there essentially because we have not invested at all in technology for creating cells from scratch, and we have been depending completely on, and we have not a single patent on any of these technologies, because most of these are proprietary technologies, so you just can't create them just like that, without violating the patents. And same story holds good as far as now. The next is a measurement of effectiveness. Is if you look at the rate of diffusion of this technology, both in terms of installed capacity as well as in terms of generation, you can see that it has actually picked up. It is almost like a textbook, picture of diffusion of an elongated S-curve, in the sense that both in terms of installed capacity and in terms of generation, what you find is that solar is occupying a very important role. For instance, in terms of generation, about 6% of the total electricity generated is from solar sources, which compares with the United States, with China, and so even with China. We compare, the 6% is with solar energy. And next, if you look at the competition in the solar module manufacturing industry, and these are Herfindahl indices, which are summary measures for measuring the degree of competition between firms, you can see that progressively it has come down, because through the ALMM policy, the approved list of models and manufacturers, the government has licensed a number of producers. So you have about 84 of them competing with each other in a range of markets, national and state level. And as a result, you have a fair amount of competition between manufacturers across the level. Recently, some amount of competition, the index has actually gone up. Means the competition is slightly reduced, but year-to-year variation, one should look at over a period of time. But at the same time, import dependence has really increased during the same time as when we have looked at. And in fact, government's data for measuring import dependence itself was faulty, because the DGCIS you need import data at 8-digit level to have an idea about how much of modules you are actually manufacturing, and we did not have an HS code for modules till quite recently. So only after just the latest year, we have HS code for modules, and when that is put, you have that orange figure bar there, which shows a very high increase. And our import dependence is largely from China, and as you can see that the import dependence has actually increased at a time when technology and when government has put a basic customs duty, etc. I can go into the discussions as to why, despite the existence of a increased customs duty, the dependence has actually increased, and I can go into the details. I don't have the time. Now, if you look at the domestic technology generating efforts, economists tend to measure first in terms of the input for that process, which is in terms of R&D expenditure, then in terms of publications and patents and so on. So if you look at the R&D expenditure, it's absolutely negligible. And if you take the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, which is the main ministry which is supporting this, its R&D expenditure is the least among all the 14 major research councils and ministries in the country dealing with science and technology. It is the least amount, almost close to zero, when you take a ratio of that to these 14 councils. So the very little sort of R&D. But one interesting thing is that there is a fair amount of scientific publications which are actually produced, because I have shown that in various other papers, the productivity of our scientists are actually very high. And so even with very little amount of money, they are able to produce a number of publications. So if you look at the number of solar photovoltaic publications which have actually emanated based on, this is from the Web of Science, which is the most important platform for measuring this. Both in terms of the number of publications as well as in terms of the quality of these publications, it has shown a dramatic increase. But if you look at the number of patents, you can see that it is only 1 or 2 for most of the year. So there hardly any kind of patents, very little R&D expenditure, but large number of publications and very little number of patents, because a lot of the science production is going on in academic institutions and not in companies. So there is a disjoint between the knowledge which is generated in the academic institutions and the actual production activity which is going on in manufacturing companies. Now, if you look at the key technological innovations in this country, I looked at 5 different areas where technology has been actually generated. So you have some sporadic, interesting attempts. And one interesting area is advanced materials, because most of the solar modules that we are actually using is from silicon and silicon-based, and these are inefficient and very costly. And in fact, if we can move to a new material called perovskite, the energy can be, the efficiency can be increased and the cost can be reduced. And there is this company, a small startup, which is based near Delhi, which is actually collaborating with IIT BHU in generating the technology for perovskite technologies. And there are tandem cells, because the silicon cells also have certain advantages. So if you can have both these put together, and that, you can have that is another material. So there is some sporadic attempts which are going on here and there, primarily to own efforts, not intervened at all by the state and so on. I can go into the details of that. For lack of time, I can. So if you look at India's perceived technological capability across the stages, various stages of this technology, polysilicon production, which is on the right at the first thing, our import dependence is extremely high. We have very limited capability at all. Very few firms are actually working on this. Some sporadic attempts here and there, but nothing much is completely dependent on imports. Wafer manufacturing, very limited domestic capacity, very high import dependence. Solar cell manufacturing, so polysilicon is then converted into wafers, then which is converted into cells. Also, there is some growing manufacturing capability, but as I said, it's only very little even now. And so there is import dependence is high. And then, of course, so module assembly, we have a large number of module assemblers, which are, we have certain amount of capability. But since we don't have capability in any of the previous stages, our overall capability is actually very, very limited. So finally, by way of conclusion, rapid expansion, we have become number 3 in the world, and it's a policy-driven growth, but very high import dependence. And technology, we are completely dependent on polysilicon wafers, cells. We are completely dependent abroad. And so the strategic focus should be not so much on increasing production at the module level, because then it will turn out to be an assembling industry. And this is the same story that you see that to some extent in mobile phones, although there can be some, yeah, and so on. So I think that's what I think. I'm sorry, I just took a little more time.
Thank you. Yeah, Professor Chidambaram to discuss the paper.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Veeramani, for this opportunity to discuss Professor Mani's paper. I thank you for that. And it's another pioneering effort by Professor Mani. You know, I need to, like I read his, when I was a PhD student, I used to read his sectoral system information papers in pharma, aerospace. So containing that tradition, I think it's quite very comprehensive paper. And now that Professor Mani has set out the lay of the land, I am doing the relatively easier task of discussing the paper in some sense, yeah. So I would start off saying that Professor Mani's paper is very comprehensive, and at least my takeaway from the paper is that it's primarily assembly that's currently going on of the SPV cells. So now, and what another thing that comes out very clearly from the paper is that compared to the world standards of scale, our manufacturing scale is considerably low. So we need to enhance that considerably. You have a table in the paper which probably because of lack of time we couldn't show it here, that how you compared China's scale with India's scale. So it's very clear that we need to scale up. So that's another insight that comes. So there are multiple insights in the paper. So I'll just pick up few insights and offer suggestions which I think will embellish the paper further. So that's what is going to be my approach to this. So now in one of the parts you actually mentioned the total number of jobs generated, and given the discussion we had in the previous session of debate between labor intensive and capital intensive manufacturing, probably you can also analyze the jobs generated with respect to the investments or subsidies, which will be useful addition and which will give you lots of insights with respect to, like, is the government money being spent well? So that would embellish, I would say. And another, the diffusion part, which you have clearly shown the S curve, you also mentioned that the importance of firm strategies for diffusion. And while in other part, you also mentioned the importance of government subsidies. So now, as per you, did they work in tandem or one worked better? So can you comment something more on that? So that will add to the analysis, in my opinion. And you presented a table of R&D expenditure, wherein you showed that MNRE's share is very, very low. It's well accepted. But what also is there in the paper is that the publications that come, which obviously they are from other departments. So basically the funding of those institutes, are they MNRE institutes or are they some other sponsored by other departments? So in some sense there's some kind of government department stepping into each other's shoes, as you may say, because you also have a table of where you have written about the R&D at IITs and IISCs, where they are carrying on photovoltaics. So in some sense, there is a government overlap of R&D. So if we are able to untangle that, probably we'll have some history about the kind of R&D that's been done, though not under the brand name of MNRE. So that could also, in my opinion, add to the paper. And one more, you showed a couple of the technological innovations that slide. But if it's possible for you to give an idea about the possible timelines of them hitting the market, so that will allow us to estimate the technological catch-up India has to do with respect to the interventions into the market. So that, as you rightly mentioned, technology capability is a very important thing. We should not be import dependent. So that I think will again add value. And one interesting table which I think probably you could not present is the imports from SPV cells from China. And exports of SPV cells to US. So basically you argue in the paper that India at some stage has imported the cells from China, but India also exports. If you juxtapose those two tables in your write-up, probably, that will make for an interesting analysis and you can offer your insights there. So these are the small points I want to say. I want to, end with one, probably, a very substantial point I would argue, is that, you're bringing the whole thing with respect to the sectoral system of innovation. And if you notice, the actors that have been selected in the PLI are Reliance, Adani, and Tata. Tata has some history of being a player in the, as shown by your table. So, how important is this selection of these players who have no history in the business till very recently to the sectoral system of innovation? So in some sense, the smaller players who have been in industry for long, they have not been in the PLI list. The bigger players are there in the PLI list. So how would this critically impact the sectoral system of innovation? This, I think, this is important because you yourself argue that our scale of innovations are still small compared to the international standard. So if you are able to bring in this, as particular aspect as to, we are talking about technological capabilities, but the companies that we have selected under PLI, Reliance, Adani, so they have no history of being in the sector. So how would this affect the system of innovation going forward? So that's all I would want to say. Thank you. Yeah.
So that is indeed a very carefully analysis of policy and associated trends by Professor Surilmani, and also very useful discussion by Chidambaran Gurunathan Iyer. Now, as I said in my initial remarks, these need to be looked at, the industrial policy need to be looked at in the broader context of global value chains. So the conventional arguments need to be revisited for industrial policy. Now our next paper is precisely on global value chains, and that will give us some idea about what need to be changed in our approach towards industrial policy in that context. So now I invite Professor Saikat Sinharai to make his presentation.
Good morning. As I stand here, I would like to thank the director CDS and the organizing committee for inviting me. Though I confirmed my presence little later in the day because I was busy with something else and did not have much time then to get into a paper. The director has given me the opportunity to come back to the area of my work which I did during my MPhil and PhD days at the CDS, but from a different angle. Because in between, for the last 4 or 5 years, I have been working something on SEZs and inequality, and I had to take a different course, and now again back to this paper on global value chains and productivity catch-up. As I stand here today, I find many of my teachers and my seniors at CDS, and the person who I'm most indebted to for my PhD is Professor K.L. Krishna, without whom I would not have submitted my PhD thesis. So he is also there. So I'm very happy that he's there to listen to what I am saying. And when I came here to do my MPhil, it was Geeta who taught me the course on international economics. I was telling her in the morning, the first course on international economics at CDS was taught by Geeta, and here I mix it up with the technology course which KK used to teach us at that point of time, and I am indebted to, and KK was my MPhil supervisor, so I am indebted to both of them indeed. Now, I do this paper with a student, a PhD student of mine, Pilu Chandra Das, who has been groomed by KLK in Pilu's formative days. He worked with KLK on the CLEMS, the famous CLEMS project, and is one of the authors of the CLEMS project. So what we decided, like the global value chain, that we take comparative advantages of countries and put them together up in the value chain. My comparative advantage in dealing with applied trade issues and Pilu's comparative advantage in estimating productivity, we put them together and try to do this paper on global value chains and productivity catch-up, evidence from Indian firms. Now, I need not elaborate on the definition of global value chain. Veeramani has done it in a very lucid way, but what I would like to add, that at each stage it would involve 2 or more countries, in this case India and the rest of the world, along with value addition at each stage from conception to end use of the product. Now, this has been facilitated by many factors, the proliferation of global value chains globally through ICT, open trade and investment regimes, reduction in transportation and transaction costs, which drove up cross-border production. Now, if you look at the figures, you would see that about 70% of global trade are linked to GVCs, involving crossing of services, raw materials, parts, and components across borders multiple times. So the growth of global value chains, however, had slowed down after 2008-2009 financial crisis due to decreased investment and increased protectionism, but they continue to play a significant role. Now, if you look at the graph, I don't know whether they're visible, the bars, as you would see, would tell you the participation in the GVC for each individual country at in 2020. The blue dot would show the participation in 1995, and the red dot would show at 2008. So you would see that the 2008 levels of GVC participation across countries, including India, which is the green bar, which we have colored differently, the GVC was higher in 2008 than in 2020, and after the slowdown of the global financial crisis, we have not come back to the 2008 levels. If you look at India, more specifically for the economy as a whole, you would find a rising trend till 2020, 2008, and then there are fluctuations over the period till 2020, whether for the economy as a whole as well as for manufacturing. And this is the stylized fact that I would carry. Why I highlight manufacturing? Because manufacturing sectors are more actively engaged in global value chain than other sectors. And here in this study, what we have tried to do is to look at the manufacturing sector. Through GVCs, there will be sequential entry of countries, and there are country level studies, and I quote from Viramani and Dhir 2024, which just came out in EPW. They did for a large range of Asian countries over a long period of time, and what they found is an inverted V pattern, some country coming into first and then later, like a flying geese type of pattern that was evident earlier, and even now for the GVC, Viramani and Dhir have found out. Now, GVC participation is seen as a growth driver for firms, enabling firms to increase their capabilities, upgrade their activities and productivity, and it is perhaps through better quality and cheaper foreign inputs in production, exposure to technology, exposure to foreign markets. Participation, and there are many studies which have actually looked, I am not getting into those studies for the paucity of time, but imported inputs actually played a major role in the GVCs. Now, if you look at this scatter plot, I have taken 64, we have taken 64 countries, including the OECD countries. The red dots would tell you about the scatter between GVC participation and average TFPG or total factor productivity growth during 1995-2008, and the blue ones obviously it's lower at during 2008 to 2018-19, and you would see, but if you take them separately, you would see that there is a slight positive trend which will drive home the fact that there is a positive relationship between GVC participation and total factor productivity growth. This on the average for the period for all the countries taken together. So there is a large body of empirical studies that supports the theoretical predictions on the impact of global value chains, although it is somewhat limited. because you see fluctuations, it's not being sustained over the period of time. And this linkage can be seen through backward linkages, not in the Hirschman sense, or forward linkage, not in the Hirschman sense, but backward linkage here would mean that where a country's export contain value added from previously imported goods from abroad, and forward linkage would mean that the country's exports are embodied in the importing country's exports to a third country. So that's the kind of backward and forward linkage we are talking about, and there are studies with regard to backward participation and forward participation. And to mention, Urata and Beek 2020 found that both backward and forward GVC participation contributes to increased productivity for countries involved in GVCs, with larger benefits for developing countries, especially when procuring intermediate goods from developed countries. Now, there are other studies which actually talk about productivity, but these studies are limited. Paul and Timmer 2020, Bushi and Owusu 2023, who say that there will be productivity catch-up, and to this we turn now. So apart from this country level, industry level studies, there are firm level studies, though not very many. And all the firm level studies have tried to show that there is a positive linkage between GVC participation and productivity growth. I would like to put it, I forgot to mention, in the broad framework of trade and growth, and where we actually are pitching in our paper. Now, in the Indian context, there are many studies, there are few studies. At the industry level, it's again Viramani and Dhir 2022, who showed that GVC participation through imported imports leading to higher gross exports, domestic value added and employment in India. And then there are firm level studies using CMI Provis database, which show that there is positive linkage between the two. Now, the existing research analyzes how integrating into global value chain facilitates productivity growth at the industry and the firm levels. Still, studies examining how lagging firms can improve their productivity and catch up with those at the productivity frontier through global value chain integration are rare. The objective of our paper is to empirically investigate how firms involving in international trade through global value chains impact the process of productivity convergence between 2020 and 2019. We have used the CMI database. We all know there are problems of missing observations in the CMI database, but we took care of that by dropping wherever we have empty cells, those firms, and then we also dropped wherever negative value of sales, value added, or compensation of employees are there. So at the end, we found that there are 9508 manufacturing firms or observations, firms spanning over 20 years and with more than 1 lakh observations. We measured productivity using the Levinson-Petrin method, though we have when we started the paper, we thought we will use the data envelopment analysis to identify frontier firms and firms which are lagging behind. We ended up with some problems. That's the future work that we need to do. And then we constructed output and input data sets using RBI data, claims database, and the national account statistics. For productivity measurement, I should mention here, because this is the place where people started talking about double deflation method in productivity measurement. However, we use single deflation method because detailed data on inputs are not available at the firm level. That constrained us. And then for capital measurement, we have used capital stock measurement. We use perpetual inventory method using the method by Srivastava, Balakrishnan et al. And Cato. And now, then we measured GVCs. We defined GVC firms as those that both intermediate goods and exports, that both import intermediate goods and exports, either intermediate goods or final goods. So, and then there is a limit. Those firms which are exporting 10% or more of their total sales are told as GVC firms, and the rest are non-GVC firms. So that's how we have had the sample of GVC and non-GVC firms. And then after doing that, only 14% of the total 1 lakh above firms we got as the GVC firms. And if you look at the distribution of the GVC and the non-GVC firms for the entire period, for the sub-periods 2000 to 2008 and 2009 to 2019, you will see the GVC firms in terms of productivity growth have outperformed the non-GVC firms. And that actually led us to actually do the analysis. Empirical analysis, we estimated a simple model, which is productivity growth as a function of the productivity growth of the, and this is the productivity growth of all non-frontier firms. So whether productivity growth of non-frontier firms are dependent on productivity growth of frontier firms, the gap between the frontier and the non-frontier firms, the GVC, and GVC interacted with the technology or productivity gap, apart from host of other controls. Now, then what we see is, this is the almost the penultimate slide. We found that the growth of the productivity for the frontier firms is driving the productivity of the non-frontier firms. The technology gap is also driving. GVC is also positively driving. But when you interact total factor productivity gap with the GVC, GVC here being counted in terms of a dummy, 0-1 dummy, you would see that there is a negative thing. So what we would do, that we would interpret age and size, they have their own interpretation. Newer and larger firms have higher productivity growth, and then productivity growth of the frontier firm is pulling up the productivity growth of the non-frontier firms, but GVC is also pulling up. But when you have GVC and the non-GVC firms, then you would see the effect has come down, because one is positive and the other is negative. And if you add the two, then as you include the GVC firms along with the non-GVC firms in the catch-up process, actually the effect actually comes down. So GVC firms, if you include in your sample, or if you think that the GVC firms are growing, the productivity is high, but if you how much they're being dragged up, actually the overall impact on total non-frontier firms is lower as you include the GVC firms. This might be a possible reason. We have not explored into that. A possible reason might be because of the productivity of the GVC firms are already higher to start with. So the initial condition for the GVC firms that they have gone into GVC because they have a higher productivity. That takes me to the Melitz framework, actually, that it's only higher productivity firms which actually are into export or are into trading, and not the lower productivity firms. Now, as this is a work in progress, I don't get into the policy conclusions. There is obviously room for industrial policy. What more we need to do is to try for an alternate measure of productivity, as I told you, using DEA, productive efficiency, to identify frontier and non-frontier firms. More to model specification, there can be alternate specifications. We need to check the robustness of the model, and we need to look at more nuanced results with non-linearity. With age and size, there might be non-linearity here, apart from looking them at the industry specific. We have not distinguished between industries, so at the industry specific level, we need to look at, and also for more intuitive explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Saikat. It's a very detailed econometric study on GVC, and it's also something where I also work recent times. So now Professor Beena to make her comments.
Thank you, Professor Saikat, my MPhil batchmate, colleague from RIS days, and also co-authored with the Pilu Chandradas. I have really enjoyed reading this paper, and this paper really adds to the growing volume of literature on participation in global value chains and total factor productivity enhancement in India. The paper makes an important contribution by distinguishing between GVC participation and its interaction with the total factor productivity convergence to the frontier. The study shows that GVC participation might slow down the total factor productivity catch-up rate of some firms. The results of this study can enhance academic and policy debates on this topic. However, there are some suggestions from my side. The authors notes that in figure 4 of the paper, slide number 5 of the PPT, they observe a positive correlation between TFP growth and GVC participation growth, which forms the basis of this study. But the TFP growth appears to be negatively correlated with the GVC participation growth between 2008 to 2018. Kindly, I would suggest you to bring 95 to 2018 kind of plot and tell us whether there is a positive or negative association. Now, regarding the techniques used in the paper, the method of estimation of labor input, on the one hand, he uses CMI Provost database, and at the same time, when it comes to emoluments and employment, he uses ASI data. Now, the emoluments per worker is calculated from ASI, but the result is applied to the data on the corporate sector of Indian economy. Now, this will naturally lead to overestimation of labor input, since the emoluments per worker for the factory sector is bound to be lower than that of the corporate sector, which is given in the CMI. Moreover, the degree of overestimation might not be uniform for all firms in the corporate sector. The overestimation might be lower for the smaller firms and higher for the larger firms. This important issue needs to be addressed. Now, when it comes to the methodological framework of this study, there are scholars like Marjit Ray Chaudhary in 2000, Bhattacharjee 2004, Androni and Chang 2019. They all have cited the non-applicability of HOS model in the context of developing nations due to the prevalence of the market imperfections that it harms capacity building in the long run. Moreover, a rich volume of studies from heterodox perspectives, both empirical and qualitative, like Kaiser 2022, Roy 2019, Durand and Milberg 2019, discuss on how this value chain perpetuate dependency and act as a source of extraction of economic rents through monopoly control over scarce resources. Neoclassical approaches tend to ignore these factors, such as oligopolistic control of lead firms over these value chains. The results of this study must be placed in this context and not ignore the various negative effects that the neoliberal growth path has had on India's industries, including the mixed blessing hypothesis cited by Seikert's paper, suggesting that while GVC chain improve productivity for some firms, they may not result in job creation. This was cited by Paul and Timmer 2020. The last point, finally, as mentioned, including earlier, the study adopts a neoclassical methodological approach to measure total factor productivity. Hence, naturally, the study should have addressed the various critique of such an approach from Straussian school to post-Keynesian and classical economic school of thoughts. Thank you.
So, truly in the spirit of the CDS tradition of open debate on important issues, now on trade policy, what should be the correct trade policy? What should be the appropriate type of industrial policy? What is the way to estimate productivity? All these things, and what are the gains from GVC participation, etc. There are positive views and also there are opposite views. So this is what generally we see always in CDS, and we see that very much in this presentation and discussion, and also in the previous, related to the previous presentation by Professor Nagaraj. So I think this raises a lot of interesting questions from the audience. So we'll take the questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you just said, we've had two excellent papers just now by Sunil Mani and Saikat, but also has laid the ground for a very interesting discussion or debate, and which links to Nagaraj's paper this morning. So one view, as you just said, is that the import content of all these exports are actually very high, as you said in the case, and I think you see that also in cell phones, as you see in. But I think the other view, Veeramani and Saikat and so on, is that you see it in a dynamic context. This is, in a sense, investment in setting up a possible dynamic path as your share. The import share will gradually come down in the value chain as you move up the value chain, as it were, if I may put it that way. So I'd really like to know your initial reactions on this, and possibly also Nagaraj, because what is your view on this new thinking of participating in global value chain?
Can I? Two very interesting papers with many policy suggestions. And in fact, both the papers emphasize the importance of industrial policy and the role of the state. I have some general kind of observations to which I think both Sunil and Saikat can respond. One is clarification. See, the chair as well as both the paper presenters emphasize the role of industrial policy and the fact that more and more papers are being written now emphasizing the role of the state and role of industrial policy. Now, it's also said that in industrialized countries also, now people are speaking about the need for industrial policy. Many countries are trying industrial policy. My question is this, the first question, that is, whether the industrialized countries were really not having industrial policy earlier, whether they said openly whether they had industrial policy or not. I think during most of this period, 50s and 60s also, they were having industrial policy. Many of the classroom examples we give, Boeing and Airbus, take Sunil about many of these industries where the state actually in industrialized countries I'm just saying that they had, industrialized countries had industrial policy, and the state was intervening, helping their lead firms in many commodity chains. I would like to get your response. Then the second part of the question. Now that our academicians are increasingly realizing, there were people who were saying that industrial policy is important earlier, but now we are having new and new converts who say that industrial policy is very important. State should intervene. That is now being emphasized across the developing nations. My question is whether it is too late to have this realization. Because what is left of state in many of these developing countries because of globalization? We are living in a world of deep integration where we don't have the border measures anymore. Tariffs, quantitative measures are not there. And in the deep integration, you are also going for policy harmonization. Intellectual property rights, IPR policy, investment policy, competition policy, you name any policy, there is harmonization happening, which is limiting the scope of state intervention. And that is what we know from deep integration. So, very little room for state intervention. Take the case of the fiscal space available to provincial governments and federal governments. India government, for example. India government is trying to reduce its size. And India government is being advised by our tribe to reduce its size everywhere. So it's withdrawing. So fiscal space for policy intervention is very limited. Then what will our state do to help our GYC participants? They can only discipline the labor, the unorganized sector, the peasants. And if you see many of the commodity chains, that is what is happening in the third world. Take the case of natural rubber, which Sunil Mani knows better than me. He has, before he started on industry, he has written, tire industry. And we had several discussions on this, not only in seminars, even otherwise, because he is interested in rubber. The current situation in rubber is, state policy is trying to extend cultivation. And as a result, world over, natural rubber prices are going down. And there is competition among natural rubber producing countries to reduce prices. As a result, in Kerala, in yesterday's seminar, we heard about that. People are not tapping rubber in Kerala and Tamil Nadu. Okay. And plantations are in a bad shape because now the state is trying to control the, just concluding, growers and laborers. So my question is, what is the recommendation as far as state policy is concerned? What can the state do?
Okay, so Professor Sten Gibson, after that Professor Joseph, then you.
I have a couple of very short questions, one to Sunil and one to Shoykot. The question to Sunil, of course, is both papers are very exciting and I really enjoyed it, but the question that came to listen to Sunil, and many other people are talking about industrial policy in the world today, is what kind, in today's world, we know that the East Asians have had industrial policy, but in today's world, when you talk about industrial policy, what kind of institutional structure, what kind of institutional agency is required to deliver, to lead the state's intervention mechanism? If you have any thoughts on that, because it's much more complicated than it used to be, and everybody's calling for it, but how do we go about doing it? So that's an important issue in terms of the structure, the discussion mechanisms, the consultative framework, etc. So that's one area. To Shoykot, I wanted to just a clarificatory question. One was, in terms of the whether or not you can tell in a short kind of form, what is the difference in productivity growth, roughly speaking, between the GVC and the non-GVC? So that wasn't very clear. And secondly, within the GVCs, is there a difference in the productivity performance of backward versus forward linkage in GVC? Can you distinguish? That's my question.
Professor Jose, then Madhuri, and then Pratima.
Thank you, Dr. Veeramani. I am aware of the dreadful consequences of not giving precedence to Pratibha, who indeed raised her hand before me. But then, regarding the presentations, extremely interesting presentations, and I'm sure they will stimulate a lot more of future research. Just two questions, very briefly, one to Sunil. You pointed attention to the kind of rapid strides we made, coming to number 3 spot, but in quantitative terms, where do we stand? Second, with this continuation of that question, if we had initiated work on photovoltaic technology related electricity generation, just around the time China did it, would we have made it to the league of generating the cheapest electricity ever in Indian, accessible to the Indian consumers? It raises important questions because do we have other alternatives? If we were to go for generating our own technology, what would have been the outcome? That's one question to you, especially in view of the fact that the sector is now being taken over by the new players and not the old established ones which Chidambaram Iyer drew attention to. Second question to Saikat, again interesting, the GVC. GVC leading to improvement in productivity, it's fairly intuitive. I'm interested in the counterintuitive part of it. Productivity advancement comes along with better employment, better standards, better wages. All these are known all over the way. But then, what's the evidence from your data about the non-GVC firms ascending the ladder to join the GVC firms? That would be of interest for further research. Thank you.
Madhuri.
Professor Mani, actually wanted to ask you about you said you were also working on the EV sector. This is not the photo, I'm not really, this is a question on the EV sector. Similarly, I think the same pattern about more of assembly is happening in even the electric vehicle sector, right? But I wanted to ask you in terms of the diffusion of these electric vehicles. I mean, initially there was a lot of euphoria with the FAME 2 policies and all that, and then each state promoting it in its own way. And mostly I think the union, like Delhi and some of the southern states doing very well in terms of the penetration. But what are the constraints now? Like, what do you think in terms of diffusion of electric vehicles now, once the policy measures have been taken off? And one question to Saikat also, that I didn't actually understand the distinction between GVC and exporting firms. Like, are you equating all GVC firms with exports? In that sense, like, are you promoting, saying that, so that's clarification I wanted.
So, after taking Pratima's question, they will answer and then we will come back to another round. Yeah, Pratima.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Congratulations to the paper presenters. And my quick remark for Professor Mani's paper. I think he has made a very lucid policy takeaway and an observation that India, even though it seems is very rapidly emphasizing on solar production, solar energy production over the recent few years, and has risen to the 3rd spot in PV module production. But as you have rightly through the paper, I now know that these cells, for the building blocks of the modules, India has high import dependence. So the policy takeaway here is that the government should now focus on technology innovation. I think MNRE is doing a good job in green hydrogen mission, which I was recently, I contributed a bit on that. So there was a 400 crore R&D expenditure on innovation, and all the big institutes of the country being brought in. And I think the same must already been happening, as Professor Iyer also pointed out, that maybe the not MNRE per se, but many government is sponsoring through different ways. So, but there is definitely a very valid, very strong policy takeaway from your paper. Thank you for that.
Professor Bardhan. Yeah.
And I'll just take 1 minute. A quick clarifying question, mainly because I'm not, this is an area I used to work a long time back, but I'm not familiar with the current empirical literature, which is relevant to both presentations. The question is there any empirical literature in India on learning functions? And let me tell you the difference of standard productivity measures or cost functions and learning function. In the learning function, the cost is related not to the current output, it's related to cumulated output. So it makes a dynamic cost function rather than a static cost function. And there are many studies abroad. I just wondered if there is any literature in India, in the Indian empirical literature, fitting learning function that will also have relevance to the point that Sudipta raised about over time protection of local protection might introduce learning. Thank you.
So there is one more question from Krishna Priya, which is related to the earlier question. So we will take that, and then you can respond, and then we'll come back.
Thank you, sir. I have a question for Professor Mani. It is related to what Professor Harilal was mentioning about the role of industrial policy and how the state should intervene. In the context of India, sir, you have mentioned that MNRE's R&D investment is very low. At the same time, I've seen that there are around 3,800 odd solar energy startups that are functioning in India. So in this context, should the government directly intervene in high-tech innovation, or should it be left for, should it just incentivize private players to undertake innovation? Because you've also seen that the papers that are coming out are not translating into patents. So is it more efficient for the private sector to innovate at the frontiers rather than like the government intervene by itself? Thank you.
First of all, I wish to thank my discussant. I'll come back to the discussion at the very end, and I will take up, first of all, Sudipto's point about moving up the value chain and learning that can be occurred by participating in a value chain. Now, this is only possible if there is if this value chain is the actors within this value chain is very tightly organized. For instance, for the value chain for solar cells, you have polysilicon manufacturers, you have wafers, you have cell manufacturers, and then you have modules. Now, all of them are put together in one actor or a few actors, and there is a fair amount of indigenous R&D activity which is going on there, and which is supported by, let's say, a public agency. Then it's possible. Take, for instance, the example of where such a learning, I may not use the term learning function, but learning has taken place, for instance, in pharmaceuticals. In pharmaceuticals, because we had a non-product patent regime, which was in existence from 1970 to 2005, and you had big private sector firms which had large indigenous R&D units, which invested very heavily in R&D and local capability making. You know, initially they started as generic drug manufacturers, and slowly over time developed the capability to make new molecules. You know, and some new molecules have been converted into pharmaceutical drugs and sold in the market and so on. So this going up the value chain and as well as you know, learning can only take place if the locus of innovative activity is happening in the same actor. If it is spread over a number of actors, and if these actors are not unified, then it's not possible. And that's the case with, so a mere participation in the value chain without an overarching arm which actually puts all these things together, and that's what you see in countries like Korea and others, where you have a large number of units, but they all work together. And there is some kind of or like, for instance, the MITI in Japan in the earlier period and so on. Okay, so you need to have such organizations. We don't seem to be having any such thing. So mere participation in the value chain will not lead to any learning. So that takes the point about Professor Bharathan's thing. I've not seen, excepting for the pharmaceutical industry, quantitative measures of learning function I've not seen. But Sanjay Lal's earlier work on learning to industrialize, for instance, a fair amount of case studies on how, what kind of learning that took place in various industrial groups and so on. But learning functions per se, I've not seen any literature. Then Professor Harilal's point about industrialized countries, whether they were already used, is there any example of industrialized countries not using industrial policy? And my argument is that in the area of high-tech industries, there has always been industrial policy. The examples that you gave, Airbus, Boeing, or NASA in space, so that's the area where the state has to directly intervene. Boeing, of course, is a private sector firm, but through public technology procurement, you had a fair amount of support which was actually given to that firm and so on. So there was industrial policies has been practiced in high-tech industries across the world. It's not something new. So that's a point which I have also been trying to say. While the government is trying to liberalize in the area of high-tech industries, you need to have the government playing an important role. But I'm not sure whether that role should be in the form of the earlier role of government, in the government itself setting up its own manufacturing units to produce that item. It can be done by the private sector or by startups, for instance, and the government can provide incentives. Now, Krishna Priya's point about giving a lot of, there are 3,000 startups and so on. I don't know what those startups are doing. They are certainly not module manufacturers. They may, because in the advanced, the approved list of manufacturers and modules, you don't find many startups, but only legacy companies and established companies. So many of them may be actually rendering various kinds of services, so they should not be confused with and also learning can also take place if there is some kind of a scale, which you have actually talked about. Because if you look at the Chinese companies, which I talk about in my paper also, the largest Chinese company is about 20 gigawatts. The largest Indian company is about 4.5 gigawatts. So that's the order of scale difference that you find. And in China, there is also a growing electronics industry, electronics manufacturing, and semiconductor industry, so which is actually required for this. So it is not just scaling up the module manufacturers, but also having a good ecosystem. Then Harilal's second point about too late to have a realization, the fiscal space is very limited and so on. I don't think this is very, it's not too late at all. It is too late in the sense that some of the technologies are cumulative and path dependent. So if you want to enter a high-tech area right now at the higher level, it's not possible. Yes, and that's precisely what the solar story is actually showing. So you try to project, and you have ended up as the third largest manufacturer of modules, but which is having a very high level of import content in terms of cells and all other components which go into making those modules. Similar story for other high-tech products like mobile phones and so on. So, so it is not so much the fiscal space, but it is rather because of the technology, which we have not given much importance for a very long period of time, excepting keep on talking that the R&D intensity of India is less than 1 and so on, but nothing has been much done. And in fact, if anything goes, the support for R&D and so on has been actually reduced. Chiranjeev, what kind of institutional structures are required? Again, the institutional structures which are required are for structures for promoting domestic technology generating activities and its translation into commercializable products. Not institutional structures which actually promotes manufacturing based on components which are taken from outside. So if you look at all our Make in India program, the production linked incentive scheme, and various other schemes that we have, it is all for making something here, but with imported technologies, you know. So, so the institutional structures that we require is basically structures which are required for improving the quality and quantity of technological inputs that can actually go into this manufacturing process. Joe's about quantitative terms about generation, I forget, I will come back to that. I forget your point. Quantitative terms, I've already said, you know, on superficial terms, we are number 3 in manufacturing modules, but these modules are based on imported components. So if you actually, you know, look at our import components, we are highly dependent on China. And in fact, just responding to you, I had actually shown this in the graph. I had converted the table into a graph. You know, and so that's why you didn't find the table, but the graph, where the chart actually shows that the import dependence on China has increased from 70 to 95%. So right now we are 95% dependent on China, Chinese imports. You know, and in addition to that, Chinese foreign direct investment has come in. The largest Chinese company has set up manufacturing because they have been importing, so they have followed the Dunning you know, story about, you know, replacing their imports with domestic manufacturing within India, taking advantage of Make in India program, production linked incentives, etc. They are setting up manufacturing plants here. So our import dependence is even going up, you know, and so that's Madhuri's point was different, not about solar photovoltaics, it's about electric vehicles, where you are talking about what are the impediments to diffusion. Now the major impediment to electric vehicle diffusion is basically range anxiety. You know, how much distance you can drive with a electric vehicle. You know, and the range anxiety is basically a function of your battery technology. And the battery technology that you have is lithium-ion batteries, which needs to be regularly replenished with charging. Now, as far as India is concerned, there is a fair amount of activity which is, so as distinct from the solar photovoltaic story, in electric vehicle, the key technology which is basically battery, you know, there is a fair amount of R&D and activity which is going on in developing various kinds of batteries, for instance, sodium batteries, which can actually lead to, you know, to lesser, larger ranges and so on. So that, if it fructifies, then that can actually lead to a more successful story. And again, in the electric vehicle story, if you look at the major manufacturers, they have also invested very heavily in R&D. For instance, if you look at our electric vehicle story is basically a 2- and 3-wheeler story. You know, it is largely dominated by 2- and 3-wheelers. And if you look at the 2-wheeler story, the largest company is Ola Electric. It has got 250 patents in the area of battery technologies, which it has been assiduously trying to develop. Okay, so so when you and also in the case of cars, for instance, both Tata Motors and Mahindra's have also been investing very heavily in various components of the electric vehicle technology. I have a detailed discussion of this technology by technology, what is going on in my chapter on electric vehicles, which of course I didn't present here, so I can't give you more information about that at the moment. Pratima Pante's lecture about green hydrogen and story. Now, well, green hydrogen may be, but that's a different technology altogether. We are talking about solar photovoltaics. There it is all fragmented, disjointed, and there is no unified approach. You know, the fact that somebody else is doing, who is that somebody else? If it is universities and research institutes which are writing papers based on solar photovoltaic technology experiments and publishing them, that is different from companies doing R&D, coming out with patents and then commercializing those patents in the form of products and processes. So the two are different. So this disjoint between, you may be very good in science production, but you are not good, you know, good in translating that science production into commercializable products. So that is not happening as far as this is concerned. So I think I have answered most of the points.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for all the comments. Thanks to Beena and all others for really letting me know that we are on the right track. Now, to start with Beena, yes, she suggested that if we can do take the period backwards to 1995, we would do it. We have started from 2000 onwards, but we thought that 2000 is a period from when India's exports actually started again picking up. Then emoluments data, I think Beena, that's where I need to tell Beena that I think you got me wrong. Emoluments data we did not use from ASI. We used the ASI information to calculate the wage rate to get the employment figures from CMI, because the wage rate or the employment figure is not there in the CMI database. So to arrive at the employment figure, we had to calculate the wage rate which is prevalent across the firms, average wage rate, and use that wage rate from the ASI data to calculate the employment figures. That's the standard procedure one follows. Now, neoclassical productivity, yes. We are thinking of using the DEA, as I have already committed. And the other thing for robustness check that we are intending to include is the labor productivity. There are studies which talk about labor productivity, looking into the impact of GVC on labor productivity, so we will look into labor productivity as well. To Professor Bardhan and Dr. Mandal's point, I have not come across any study as yet on the cumulative learning function or the dynamic cost function. Indeed, we have a plan to look into the dynamic cost function. I have already told my students to look into the data, but the CMI data is actually not very disaggregated, unlike the ASI data, and we might have to do it at the industry level, where from the ASI data to look what is the kind of dynamic cost function one has in that particular industry, and then look at the learning curve. Let me go to Chiranjeev's point on the productivity growth of GVC and non-GVC firms. If you look at the TFPG figure for 2000 to 2019, for non-GVC firm, it is for the period as a whole, it's minus 0.02. And for the GVC firm, it's still declining, but it's minus 0.01. So GVC firms are growing at maybe a lower negative rate. If you take the period 2000 to 2008, the TFPG growth, TFPG for GVC firms is a lot higher than the non-GVC firms. And if you look at 2009 to 2019, that's when you would see 2009 to 2019, you would see again it's the same picture as 2000 to 2009, that GVC firms having a lower negative growth than the non-GVC firms. So indeed GVC firms are performing better in terms of TFP growth over non-GVC firms. You have another question on backward and forward linkages. Backward, here we are considering only backward linkage because the database does not allow you to take account of the importing country's export to the third country. There is no data on the trade network actually. So we are unable to look at the forward linkage that we, or forward participation that we are talking about. So whatever estimation we are doing here in this paper, it relates to the backward participation. That takes me to Madhuri's question. Madhuri has asked about a distinction between GVC and exporting firms. No, exporting firms are those which are only exporting. GVC firms which are importing intermediates as well as exporting, which are importing intermediates as well as exporting with regards to, and so it has to be a two-way trade. It's importing on the one hand and exporting on the other hand. Exporting only if they're exporting more than 10%, only those firms we are taken as GVC firms. Okay. And if it's one-way trade, either importing or exporting for those firms which are treated as non-GVC firms, those firms actually should have to be prominent. They should not, I'll tell you the details of that. Export less than 10% of their total sales, we are not considering there. So this is how we are distinguishing between GVC and exporting firms. And that's standard in the literature. And now let me go to Jose's point of whether non-GVC firms are attaining GVC status. Now, actually, if there is a productivity improvement of the non-GVC firms, and as there is a productivity improvement, as we are seeing from the paper, they will automatically self-select into the export market. That's what the Melit's theory actually predicts, that if there is productivity improvement, more than catering to the domestic market, they also start catering to the world market at large. Let me come to Harilal's point. There is room for industrial policy. In case of GVC, the industrial policy is not, the room for industrial policy is not disciplining labor alone. It would be, that is the lee side of the policy. The other thing will be to focus on specific segments of the industry. Earlier we were doing the umbrella industry at large. Now, when you are participating in GVC, you are value adding only in one segment of the total value chain, and that's where the industrial policy has to come into picture. So intervention from the government or focus from the government has to come there, and then there has to be adequate supporting institutions for the purpose in terms of policy. So thank you everyone. Let me stop here. I think I have addressed most of the questions that were asked to me. Thank you so much.
So I thought I will use 2 minutes to kind of do some publicity for the kind of work that we are doing in CDS in recent times related to this theme. So one is that there is a recent paper that is published in Journal of Policy Modeling. I remember when I was in the IG area, Professor Bardhan gave a lecture on you need to look at import openness not as a complete measure that we people use import as a share of GDP, but by separating import of final goods from intermediate goods. So he said that in East Asian model, East Asian countries followed that type of a model. They allowed easy import of intermediate goods, but put restrictions on final goods. So we did a very detailed study using CLEMS data cross-country, input-output, world input-out database, separating final goods from intermediate goods, and we find a result which is very much consistent with what Professor Bardhan suggested, that import of intermediate goods always help productivity and growth, whereas final goods has no impact. So that is a very important work that we did, and we have published that recently. And the other important work related to GVC, there is a lot of discussion about, debate about mobile phones, whether what we are doing in India. Recent times mobile phone exports from India has really gone up, and we have become one of the top exporters of the world. Professor Nagaraj mentioned about it, and even Raghuram Rajan has been very critical about this, saying that this is just assembly and PLI scheme is getting misused for this purpose. So what we did recently, this study is going to be released in Delhi in sometime very soon, where we are going to get policy makers, etc., is that we looked at a very, very detailed input-output table, some 5,000 columns, 5,000 rows, 5,000 in 5,000 dimension input-output table from the ASI plant level data. This is a very detailed work, and it is a time series of input-output table. We could, in that table, isolate mobile phones as a separate industry, and we could find out which are the domestic industries with which mobile phone has established a linkage. And we can also separate imported inputs from that, because the ASI gives that separate information. And we found that it is not simple assembly. Yes, it was initially assembly. Earlier, mobile phone domestic value addition of mobile phone production in total value of output was 8% in 2018. It has gone up to 22%. It has established linkages with some niche areas within Indian manufacturing as well as services sector, because mobile phone manufacturing requires services as an input, and since India has already established certain competence in services, that linkages has got established. So it has gone up, domestic value added as a percentage of output has gone up from 8% to 22%. This is indirect linkages, so backward linkages have been established. And we also estimated number of jobs created, direct and indirect, wage income that is created. So what Raghuram Rajan pointed out, yes, it is true that Professor Nagaraj also showed the import part, trade deficit part. So the problem with that graph, which Raghuram Rajan's paper also pointed out, the problem is that they assume that everything that we imported under HS codes are used in mobile phone. So all those parts and components which are under HS codes are used in mobile phone, which is not true. They are used for multiple purposes, various industries. So our output table, through that we were able to capture what proportion of that is actually used in mobile phone. So in the calculation that Raghuram Rajan and Koders provided, they assumed that it is 100%. And they said that even if you assume 40%, still there is a trade deficit, but actually it's much below 40%. We found that the average is 22%. Like batteries, cameras, all these we import, but it is wrong to say that all that we import is used in mobile phone. But in our analysis, we are able to identify what proportion is exactly used in mobile phone. Therefore, we are able to find out exact trade balance, and it is surplus. It is, even after accounting for imported components, it is still a surplus. And there is also evidence that there is upgrading taking place, moving up in the what called the smile curve. There is little bit of evidence that it is going up. And this is the model that is done by all countries. It is assembly and then entering into assembly and then moving up in the value chain. Of course, industry policy play an important role in that process. I am not saying that it is automatic. Industry policy play, and that's what Professor Sudipta Mandal also mentioned in the morning, that if you want to move up in the value chain, that is where I think in this current context, industry policy has to be kind of understood in a different way. Thank you. Any other questions? We have maybe 5 minutes. Yes. So, okay. Yes.
I'm sorry to come back again a second time, but from these discussions, a very interesting thing comes out about R&D and innovation. I was going to say that our Indian entrepreneurs are really lazy and hardly do any R&D, except if it's a little bit of adaptation to the Indian market and so on. What Sunil has just said, I'm very pleased to qualify that at least in one case we know, that is the electric vehicles, the two-wheelers, three-wheelers, that we are actually doing more basic research, and we've done it all along in pharmaceuticals. So that is promising, but I think, I mean, global history tells us that most of the big breakthroughs technologically, I mean, just few examples, green revolution, internet, space, etc., very often comes from the public sector. And I think that in our case, they don't have to produce all this research only in the public sector, but play that coordinating role between enterprises who are part of some cluster to help them actually do real R&D and not just this little bit of low-end stuff, especially in for pharmaceuticals in these materials which we have all depend on China. The same goes for materials for batteries and so on in EV. So, I mean, just a thought, but I'd like to know what you all feel about it.
Just a quick point in support of what you're saying in response to Harilal's question 1, which is that if you look at least for the US, Department of Defense played a huge role, has played, continues to play a huge role in being that apex body that funnels investment into research. And it's not just applied research, it's basic research, scientific papers, econometricians, everybody at one point, I don't know if that's still the case, used to get Department of Defense contracts to do things which had no immediate direct relationship to application. So, but that role, so it's not even entirely a thing of saying they're only doing scientific papers. I agree with you, but someone is not picking it up and then doing the next level agglomeration, which I think, and I think that's what Sudipta was saying, worldwide, this phenomenon of needing an apex institution, usually public sector, to do this is essential. And Shaikat, I just had one question. I understand the way GVC measurement is being done, but as far as we are concerned, I think it would be interesting, what if you were to not exclude the pure exports? Suppose you were to do your standard GVC measurement plus exports, how much would we get? What would your numbers look like in that context? Because one could make the obvious argument that if they are exporting without importing, and they're able to do that, somehow they're breaking into markets. And that may be something that's as interesting in combination with the standard GVC measure, which takes only the two-way flow.
This is to Sunil Mani, sir. Sir, the takeaway from your talk is that technology gap goes hand in hand with the patent gaps. My stance in this regard is that, what I gather is that we lack the US or Chinese ecosystem of infrastructure regarding semiconductor area, the EV, electric battery area, and the photovoltaics. So it is very affordable to a country like India to import such products because it involves exponential level of infrastructure expenses. What China has is such a wonderful infrastructure of microelectronics, which we lack in India. And US also have such an infrastructure expenditure level. And we lack the PPP ecology in China and US, not so much in India. So what is your take on it? The PPP ecosystem prevailing in China and in US is lacking in India.
So Suraj, Professor Suraj, after that will come to.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Professor Harilal's second question about is it too late? And I think both speakers responded, but I interpreted the question differently. I thought he was inviting us to wonder about today's context, right? And what is the nature of regulation possible in these fluid GVC kinds of setups? And all that's possible is to regulate labor, or but these, this idea of capital is footloose. I thought he was kind of indicating something like that, and so I want to see whether there are any larger speculations, reflections on what is the nature of the domestic regime, what is the nature of the international regime, and what are the links between these kinds of big businesses, right, between the domestic and does all that therefore mean that today the context has changed and therefore it's too late, not just the fact that there's path dependence. So I don't know whether you meant it like that, but that's the way I interpret it. So Yeah, thank you. Professor Nagaraj.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm happy that Veeramani said he has done new work which is showing greater. I'm so delighted that what the evidence I provided is inadequate. But let me start with this. You know, we are very happy with the import. I mean, the mobile phone exports. We have some of my younger colleagues have done this work. You know, comparing India's performance during the last 15 years with Vietnam's performance. Okay, and our performance is pathetic compared to Vietnam's exports. Okay, and their valuation has gone up enormously. And I tell you one thing, in this all this missing is, if you want to increase your domestic content, you must make investments. Okay, physical investment is important. Can you, in your large input-output table which you talked about, I'm so delighted to know about that. Okay, can you say how much investment has taken place? Because ultimately, I mean, fixed investment cannot be ruled out completely. Okay, I know ideas matter, you know, human capital matters, but physical investment has not been done away with. Okay, so I mean, of course, I look forward to your results, and also I think we must see what's happened to investments. Okay, that's first point. Secondly, about Sunil's thing, I'll tell you this, you're looking at extremely micro numbers. Instead of it, look at more aggregate. Like I think Naushad Forbes has been providing, in fact, in his common, in op-eds he writes in Business Standard, he has been providing some very telling data. You know, you have been happy with the pharmaceutical industry 3 decades ago. Today, it's in a pathetic shape. Their R&D has completely been much less. And in fact, Naushad, in fact, I have the data with me, I can show it. You take the top 5 companies of major pharmaceutical producers across the world, and they look at their R&D intensity. India is the worst. Okay, again, private corporate sector, I think there's a lot of euphoria that there's a lot of investment taking place. Again, Naushad has provided this data for the top 500 companies, top 250 companies of Indian corporate sector. Their R&D investment is pathetic. So let us be more, I know you are critical, but I think you need to be more of it. Because Indian private sector doesn't invest. In fact, they spend more money in buying their own stocks, you know, in speculating in the stock market, because the returns are higher, immediate returns, and they don't invest in R&D. I'm not saying this. Naushad, who himself is the biggest, one of the very technology intensive industrialists, okay, he's saying this, so we must take it seriously. Thank you.
Professor Krishna. After that, Professor Madhul, Professor Joseph. Last. After
I'll be very brief. This refers to the work of presented by Nagaraj. I have been an admirer of Nagaraj for decades. I think he has been working consistently on the manufacturing sector and its performance. What I would like to suggest to him is, he should also look at the individual industries rather than the manufacturing sector as a whole. There may be some industries which are doing better than other industries. Also, the regional dimension also is important. There are some states which are doing well, many which are not doing well. About the aspect of doing it at the industrial level, the CLEMS database distinguishes 13 manufacturing industries, and they have computed productivity for each of these 13 industries. I think that kind of a dimension should be explored in future work. I'm not suggesting you do it now, but I think that is one aspect which is important. Thank you.
Professor Murdwil and then Professor Joseph. Then we'll come to.
It's tied to the larger question you were asking, Veeramani, about industrial policy and how do we look at GVC within this industrial policy. Because I was thinking that in economies like ours, we also have agro-based industries, you know, where the last node is actually firms which employ large workforces. So, you know, you can't have GVCs without discussing, like cashew, I mean, a very clear example in Kerala. So we have to keep things like this in mind.
Professor Joseph.
Yeah, I think I know that the marginal social product of every question will be now almost negative. I will stop. You are looking for food now. I am more than anyone else concerned about the low R&D intensity in this country. Now let me just give a result from Professor K.L. Krishna's analysis. India's FDI is maybe 1/4 of China. And only 8% of Indian companies for technology licensing, whereas it is something like 18%. R&D intensity of China is 4 times India, but total factor productivity estimate by, I'm saying it because our most respected K.L. Krishna and his team using CLEMS data shown that India's total factor productivity growth is higher than China. I was told that it's a mistake. I checked with APC. Asian Productivity Council also, I repeat, APC also, not quoting them separately, argued that India's total factor productivity is conventionally understood as an indicator of productivity, and our black hole, our like of, which we don't know, whatever it is high. Now that prompted me to examine the fact that while I want them to do R&D, in this world, what is innovation all about? Innovation is an outcome as per the innovation system language perspective. What we saw is a kind of articulation of knowledge generation. That knowledge can be scientific knowledge, documented knowledge, which comes out of R&D. Equally important, my dear friends, is DUI. Drawing from Kenneth Arrow and others, using interacting mode of learning. That kind of knowledge is equally important. That when yesterday our Professor Pranab was talking, we estimated this aspect of Indian manufacturing industry, and we found that firms which are showing high productivity are the ones who are investing in DUI mode of learning by way of labor training the labor force. We took similar indicators like that. So we have, if you get deep into the innovation language, you will be able to, this is not to say that what Professor Gidasan said, Mariana Mazzucato has clearly articulated in his book, Making and Taking of Value in the Modern Economy, the role that public institutions and government has played in the modern capitalist world, and they are now preaching as you take a back seat. No, I agree with all that, but then
global value chains. So in some cases, the Indian firms participating in the global value chains may be playing a very important role, like chain governance, or firms which are very close to the chain governance firms. But in some others, they'll be just participating, and they'll be at the receiving end as far as chain governance is concerned. So you can compare such GVCs and see how your productivity measures vary according to the nature of the global value chain you are examining.
So last question.
Hello, sir. This question is a clarificatory question to the Professor Sunil Mani. Sir has shown that total installed capacity in the electricity generations. Sir, is that included the captive power plants as well? If you excluded these things from the total installed capacity, the captive power plants share is very much higher in India. So though we have a RPO obligations, over the trends like very higher in the share of total share for the our captive power plants, will that negatively impacts this our contribution to the energy transition? Then the second one is that we have a state level equally responsible policy to the national one, state wise different, and our set of goals and objectives are equally contribute to the national. But when we come to the center, state and the private participation in this, when it is a crucial time, that by the time like a center and state like a given up, only the private capturing the things and diffusion even includes in the case of electric vehicles also, you can see we have the roughly EV at 30. Means 30% of the total like vehicles we need to achieve like electricity. Like EV, but still we are about to reach only 6.5% only. So what's your take on this, sir?
Thank you. So quickly, well, in response to the last question, the data consists of grid connected electricity. So if the captive plants are grid connected, it is included. Otherwise, it's not included. And because we are only talking about how much of electricity is grid connected. So the solar plants there are also solar plants which are based on batteries where it's not connected to the grid at all. So that's not taken into account. If it's taken that into account, then I think it'll be also quite high. So it's not easy to talk anything about that. The other points I think we have.
Yeah, we discussed most of them. Very brief.
Thank you for all the comments. Coming to Suraj, I think that's a very large debate, and I don't want to stand between the lunch and this giving my answer. So I'll talk to you over lunch on this. I have a position on that, and where is the room for industrial policy now in the context of global value chains? I'll talk to you. Thank you, Harilal, for your important suggestion, and also to Geeta for her suggestion. I will look into all the suggestions, and thank you, because this is a work in progress, and hope this culminates into a good paper so that it can be part of the PhD thesis of my student. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. I think we earned our lunch now, so let's see.
We are breaking for lunch. The next session will happen by 2 o'clock.